Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Family Dinner. Russell Klein adjusted his tie as he pulled into his in-laws' circular driveway, the mansion's colonial facade gleaming under the evening sun. Beside him, his wife Tracy fidgeted with her phone, typing furiously. In the back seat, their 7-year-old daughter, Emma, swung her legs, humming softly. "Put the phone away, honey," Russell said quietly, his steel-gray eyes meeting Tracy's in the rearview mirror. "Your parents hate when you're distracted during dinner." Tracy's fingers hesitated over the screen before she slipped the device into her purse. "You're right. Sorry." Russell had been married to Tracy Chandler Klein for 9 years, and her family's monthly dinners had become a sacred tradition. Douglas Chandler, a retired federal judge, and his wife Francine had welcomed Russell into their family with open arms when he'd married their only daughter. They saw him as the successful architect who'd given Tracy the stability they'd always wanted for her. If only they knew the truth about their precious daughter. The Chandler family home was a testament to old money and judicial prestige. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the hallways. Douglas had inherited the house from his father, also a judge, and the weight of legal tradition seemed to permeate every room. "Russell, my boy," Douglas boomed as they entered, his imposing frame filling the doorway. Even at 72, the former judge commanded respect with his silver hair and sharp blue eyes. "How's the business? That shopping complex project still keeping you busy?" "Busier than ever," Russell replied, shaking his father-in-law's firm hand. "The city approved our expansion plans last week." Francine emerged from the kitchen, her elegant gray hair perfectly styled, wearing pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. "Emma, sweetheart, come give Grandma a hug." Emma rushed into her grandmother's arms, chattering about school and her friends. Russell watched his daughter with a mixture of love and careful calculation. Emma was the only innocent party in this house, and he intended to keep it that way. Dinner proceeded as it always did. Francine had prepared her signature pot roast, and the conversation flowed between Russell's architectural projects, Douglas's golf game, and Emma's upcoming school play. Tracy seemed more animated than usual, laughing at her father's stories and asking her mother about the book club. Russell observed everything with the precision of a man who'd learned to read people like blueprints. Tracy's nervous energy, the way she kept glancing at her purse, the slight flush in her cheeks when her phone buzzed during dessert. "Excuse me," Tracy said, standing abruptly. "I need to use the powder room." Russell nodded and continued his conversation with Douglas about property values, but part of his mind tracked Tracy's footsteps. She was heading upstairs, not to the downstairs bathroom. To text him, no doubt. Austin Hurley, personal trainer at Tracy's gym. 28 years old, all muscles and charm and empty promises. Russell had discovered their affair 3 months ago, and since then, he'd been building something beautiful, something devastating. "Daddy," Emma whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "I dropped my napkin." "Here, sweetheart." Russell handed her his own napkin and watched her crawl under the table to retrieve hers. That's when she saw it. Emma's small gasp was barely audible, but Russell caught it. His daughter's face went pale as she climbed back in her chair, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave. Now," she whispered urgently in his ear. Russell leaned down, his voice calm and controlled. "What happened, Emma? You didn't look under the table." Russell made a show of bending down to look, his hand brushing against the manila envelope he'd carefully taped there earlier that week. Inside were photographs, bank statements, and a letter, all meticulously crafted to tell a very specific story. He sat back up, his face a mask of concerned confusion. "Douglas, there's something under your table." An envelope. The former judge's eyebrows furrowed as Russell handed him the package. Douglas opened it with the same careful precision he'd once used to review court documents. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, horror, and finally, cold fury. "What is this?" Douglas's voice was deadly quiet. The photographs showed Tracy and Austin in various compromising positions, But that wasn't the damning part. The bank statements showed a joint account Russell had never seen before. The letter, written in Tracy's handwriting, Russell had practiced for weeks to perfect her script, detailed plans to disappear with Austin and Emma after Russell's accident. I don't understand, Russell said, his voice carefully modulated to show the right amount of shock and betrayal. Francine looked at the documents, her hand flying to her throat. Oh my God, Tracy's been planning to kill me, Russell finished quietly. And take Emma. The sound of Tracy's heels on the stairs signaled her return. She walked into the dining room with a smile that died the moment she saw the envelope's contents spread across the table. What's all this? She asked, but her voice had already changed. Russell could hear the fear creeping in. Douglas stood slowly, his judicial training taking over. Tracy Chandler Klein, I think you need to explain these documents. Tracy's eyes darted between the papers and Russell's face. She was quick, he'd give her that. Quick enough to realize she was trapped, but not quick enough to see how carefully the trap had been constructed. This isn't. Russell, you know I would never. Know what, Tracy? Russell's voice was ice. Know that you've been sleeping with Austin Hurley for 6 months? Know that you've been planning to fake my death and disappear with our daughter? Which part should I know? Emma looked between her parents, confusion and fear warring on her small face. Russell reached over and gently squeezed her hand. It's going to be okay, sweetheart. Daddy's going to take care of everything. 5 hours later, after the police had been called, after Tracy had been arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and attempted kidnapping, Russell sat in Douglas's study with his former father-in-law. I'm sorry you had to see this, son, Douglas said quietly. I can't believe my own daughter. Neither can I, Russell replied, accepting the glass of whiskey. But we have to think about Emma now. She's been through enough. Douglas nodded grimly. You'll have my full support in the custody proceedings. After tonight, he shook his head. Tracy will never see that child again if I have anything to say about it. Russell sipped his whiskey and stared out the window into the darkness. Phase 1 was complete. Tracy was in custody, her reputation destroyed, her family turned against her. But this was just the beginning. Austin Hurley had no idea what was coming for him. Chapter 2. The Architect's Blueprint. 3 months earlier, Russell Klein had been a successful man living what he thought was a successful life. His architectural firm, Klein & Associates, had just won the contract for the city's largest commercial development in decades. His wife was beautiful, his daughter was brilliant, and his bank account reflected 15 years of smart investments and harder work. That Tuesday morning in March had started like any other. Russell was reviewing blueprints in his downtown office when his assistant, Leah Atwood, knocked on his door. Mr. Klein? Your wife's gym called. She left her car keys in the locker room, and they're closing early for maintenance. They asked if you could pick them up. Russell had kissed Tracy goodbye that morning as she headed to her Pilates class, the same routine they'd maintained for 3 years. She always drove herself to the gym, always came home refreshed and glowing. He'd never questioned it. The Fitness Elite Gym was a high-end facility in the suburbs, all glass and chrome, and membership fees that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Russell had signed Tracy up there as an anniversary gift, thinking the yoga and Pilates classes would help with her chronic stress. I'm here for my wife's keys, Russell told the receptionist, a young woman with elaborate nail art who barely looked up from her phone. Tracy Klein, right? Austin said to tell you she's in the massage room if you want to grab her. Russell felt the first cold touch of suspicion. Tracy had never mentioned massages. He followed the receptionist's directions down a hallway lined with motivational posters and the sound of expensive exercise equipment. The massage room door was slightly ajar. Russell could hear Tracy's voice, breathless, and saying things he'd never heard her say to him. When he peered through the crack, he saw his wife of 9 years straddling a man who definitely wasn't a licensed massage therapist. Austin Hurley was everything Russell wasn't. Young where Russell was mature, impulsive where Russell was calculated, all raw physicality where Russell was refined intelligence. Tracy was moving above him with an abandon Russell hadn't seen since their honeymoon. Russell watched for exactly 30 seconds, memorizing every detail with the precision that had made him a successful architect. Then he walked away, retrieved Tracy's keys from the front desk, and drove home to wait. When Tracy returned that evening, flushed and claiming her Pilates instructor had really pushed the class hard, Russell kissed her cheek and asked about her day. She lied smoothly, mentioning the difficulty of the poses and how sore she felt. That night, as Tracy slept beside him, Russell stared at the ceiling and began to plan. The investigation phase had taken Russell 2 weeks. He was methodical by nature, and betrayal had only sharpened that focus. He hired a private investigator, Tyrone Wise, a former police detective who specialized in matrimonial cases. Within days, Russell had photos, timestamps, hotel receipts, and phone records. Tracy and Austin had been conducting their affair with the casual arrogance of people who thought they were smarter than everyone around them. They used Austin's apartment, cheap motels on the outskirts of town, and even Tracy's car in various parking lots. The pattern showed escalation, from stolen hours to full afternoons, from hidden conversations to elaborate lies about shopping trips and book clubs. But Russell wanted more than just evidence of adultery. He wanted total destruction. "You sure about this path, Mr. Klein?" Tyrone had asked during their final meeting. The detective was a large black man in his 50s, with intelligent eyes and the careful demeanor of someone who'd seen humanity at its worst. "Divorce court would give you everything you want. Full custody, alimony, the works. This other route, it's dangerous." Russell had studied the man across from him. Tyrone Wise had 23 years with the city police, a spotless record, and a reputation for discretion. But he also had 2 teenage daughters and a wife who'd been battling cancer. Medical bills, college tuition, and a detective's pension didn't add up to financial security. "Mr. Wise, how much would it be worth to you to ensure my daughter never has to question whether her mother loved her enough to stay?" The conversation that followed had established Russell's true nature. He wasn't interested in winning. He was interested in total annihilation. Tracy had broken something fundamental when she chose Austin Hurley over their family, and Russell intended to break something fundamental in return. The plan Russell constructed was architectural in its complexity. Every element supported the others. Every detail served multiple purposes, and the foundation was built on Tracy's own weaknesses. Phase 1 required patience. Russell began documenting Tracy's lies, recording their conversations, and building a timeline that would later support his narrative. He opened a secret bank account in Tracy's name, making deposits that matched her gym visits. He practiced her handwriting until he could forge her signature flawlessly. Phase 2 involved Austin Hurley directly. Russell learned everything about the young man, his background, his debts, his dreams, his fears. Austin was from a working-class family in Ohio, had dropped out of college to pursue a fitness career, and was deeply in debt from a failed supplement business. He was exactly the kind of desperate man who might believe he'd found his meal ticket in a lonely suburban housewife. Russell began showing up at the gym, not to confront anyone, but to establish himself as a presence. He took out a membership, started working with a different trainer, and made friends with the staff. He learned the schedules, the routines, the gossip. "Austin's a good kid," the gym manager, Santos Keenan, had told Russell one evening. "Little naive, maybe. Falls for the hard luck stories, you know? Always trying to help people out of tight spots." Perfect. Austin was a rescuer, a white knight looking for damsels in distress. Tracy must have played that role beautifully. The neglected wife, the misunderstood woman trapped in a loveless marriage with a cold, successful husband. Phase 3 was the masterpiece. Russell planted the seeds of the idea slowly, carefully. A comment here about feeling threatened by a client. A mention there about updating his will. He let Tracy overhear a phone call about increasing his life insurance policy. The joint bank account required more finesse. Russell needed Tracy to believe she was being clever, that she was preparing for their future together without Russell's knowledge. He arranged for Austin to discover investment opportunities that required initial capital, then sat back and watched Tracy drain her personal accounts to fund them. The forged letter was Russell's crowning achievement. Written in Tracy's handwriting, it detailed plans for Russell's accident, complete with Austin's promise to help her start fresh somewhere else with Emma. The plan was plausible enough to be believable, but sloppy enough to be discovered. All Russell needed was the perfect moment to spring the trap. The dinner at his in-laws' house provided that moment. Douglas Chandler's judicial background would lend credibility to the discovery, and Francine's emotional reaction would eliminate any doubt about Tracy's guilt. Emma's innocent witnessing of the evidence would seal the case. As Russell sat in his home office the night before the dinner, reviewing the final details of his plan, he felt no guilt. Tracy had made her choice when she decided to betray their family. Austin had made his choice when he decided to pursue a married woman with a child. Now, they would face the consequences of those choices. Russell Klein had spent his career building structures that would last. Tomorrow, he would demonstrate that he was equally skilled at tearing them down. Chapter 3. The Trap Springs. The holding cell at the city jail was nothing like the movies made it seem. Tracy Klein sat on a narrow bench, still wearing the navy dress she'd chosen for her parents' dinner, her hands shaking as she tried to process what had just happened. The charges were serious: conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and fraud. The prosecution was arguing that she and Austin had planned to kill Russell and flee the country with Emma and Russell's life insurance money. "This is insane," Tracy whispered to her court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking woman named Madeline Sanford who'd been assigned to the case at midnight. "I've never seen those documents before in my life." Madeline reviewed the evidence file with a weary expression of someone who'd heard similar claims hundreds of times. "Mrs. Klein, the handwriting analysis on this letter shows a 94% match to your known samples. The bank account has your signature on the opening documents. And these photographs." Tracy couldn't look at the photos again. Seeing herself with Austin, captured in moments she'd thought were private, made her feel physically sick. But those intimate images weren't what would destroy her. They were just the foundation for something much worse. "Someone's setting me up," Tracy insisted. Russell's done this somehow." "Your husband? The man who called the police? The man whose in-laws witnessed him discovering evidence of your alleged plot to murder him?" Madeline's skepticism was obvious. "Mrs. Klein, I need you to focus on reality here. We need to discuss plea options." Down the hall, Russell Klein was giving his statement to Detective Oscar Schultz, a 20-year veteran of the force who specialized in domestic crimes. Russell's performance was flawless. The shocked husband, the concerned father, the betrayed man struggling to understand how his wife could plan such violence. "I keep thinking about Emma," Russell said, his voice cracking slightly. "She's the one who found the envelope. What if Tracy had gone through with this? What if my daughter had lost both parents?" Detective Schultz nodded sympathetically. "Mr. Klein, I know this is difficult, but we need to go through the timeline again. When did you first suspect your wife might be having an affair?" Russell had rehearsed this conversation 100 times. "I didn't want to believe it. There were little signs, phone calls she wouldn't answer in front of me, unexplained absences, mood changes. But I thought maybe she was planning a surprise or going through something personal. I never imagined this." The detective's questions continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of Russell's marriage, his relationship with his in-laws, and his discovery of the evidence. Russell answered with the measured responses of a man trying to be helpful while processing devastating news. "What about this Austin Hurley? Did you know him before tonight? I'd seen him at the gym a few times. Tracy mentioned he was her trainer, but I thought it was just professional." Russell paused, as if remembering something painful. "Actually, now that I think about it, she did start working out more frequently about 6 months ago. She said she wanted to get in shape for our 10th anniversary next year." While Russell was cementing his victim narrative with the police, Austin Hurley was having the worst night of his life. He'd been arrested at his apartment at 2 a.m., pulled from his bed by police officers who'd informed him he was wanted for conspiracy to commit murder. "I don't understand what's happening," Austin told his attorney, a public defender named Julius Haynes who looked barely older than Austin himself. "Tracy and we never talked about hurting anyone. We were in love." Julius reviewed the case file with growing alarm. "Mr. Hurley, they have bank records showing payments from Mrs. Klein to you totaling over $40,000. They have recorded conversations between you two discussing her husband's life insurance policy. And they have this letter, allegedly written by Mrs. Klein, that explicitly mentions your involvement in planning Mr. Klein's death. Austin felt like he was drowning. The money. Tracy said she wanted to invest in my business. She was helping me start a new gym. And we never. She complained about her husband sometimes, said he was cold and controlling, but we never planned to hurt anyone. What about the life insurance discussions? She mentioned that Russell had increased his policy recently. She thought it was strange, said he'd been acting paranoid about his safety. But we never. God, I would never hurt anyone. The evidence against both Tracy and Austin was overwhelming. But the case had one significant flaw that neither defendant nor their attorneys had yet recognized. Russell Klein was the only source for most of the crucial information. The letter had been discovered by Russell. The bank account information had been provided by Russell's financial advisor, who noticed suspicious activity on Tracy's accounts. The recordings of allegedly incriminating conversations had been made by Russell's security system. Detective Schultz was thorough, but he was also looking at what appeared to be a straightforward case of domestic betrayal turned deadly. A cheating wife, her lover, and a plot to murder the husband for insurance money. It was a story he'd seen variations of throughout his career. The evidence is solid, Schultz told his partner, Detective Crystal Fuller, as they reviewed the case the next morning. Klein's story checks out. The physical evidence supports everything he's told us, and both defendants have motive and opportunity. Fuller, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s, was more skeptical. Something feels too neat about this. The husband just happens to find all this evidence on the same night. His 7-year-old daughter just happens to spot the envelope under the table. Sometimes cases are straightforward, Fuller. Not everything's a conspiracy. Meanwhile, Russell was meeting with his attorney, Wendell Warren, a partner at the city's most prestigious law firm. Warren specialized in family law and had a reputation for protecting his clients' interests with ruthless efficiency. The criminal charges against your wife make the divorce proceedings much simpler, Warren explained. Full custody of Emma is virtually guaranteed, and given the circumstances, you'll likely be awarded the majority of marital assets. Russell nodded, playing the part of the grieving husband. I just want what's best for Emma. She's been through enough trauma already. Of course, we'll also need to discuss the life insurance policy you mentioned. Since Mrs. Klein won't be able to claim it due to her alleged plot, you'll want to update the beneficiaries. The insurance policy was another carefully constructed element of Russell's plan. He'd increased the coverage and made sure Tracy knew about it, planting the seed that would later support the prosecution's motive theory. By the end of the week, the local media had picked up the story. Suburban mom plotted husband's murder read the headline in the city paper, accompanied by photos of Tracy and Austin being led away in handcuffs. Russell gave a carefully worded statement to reporters, emphasizing his concern for Emma and his shock at discovering his wife's alleged betrayal. I'm focusing on my daughter right now, he told the cameras. She's lost her mother to this situation, and I want to help her heal and move forward. Emma, meanwhile, was staying with her grandparents Douglas and Francine, who were struggling to process their daughter's arrest. Russell visited daily, the concerned father checking on his traumatized child. She keeps asking when mommy's coming home, Francine told Russell through her tears. What do I tell her? The truth, as gently as possible, Russell replied. That mommy made some very bad choices, and now she has to face the consequences. Douglas had used his judicial connections to stay informed about the case progress. The evidence is damning, he told Russell privately. I can't believe I raised a daughter capable of this. Russell put a comforting hand on the older man's shoulder. None of us could have predicted this. Tracy fooled us all. As the weeks passed, Russell's plan continued to unfold perfectly. Tracy and Austin were denied bail due to the severity of the charges. Their attorneys struggled to mount a defense against evidence that seemed ironclad. The media painted them as cold-blooded conspirators who'd plotted to destroy a family for money and lust. But Russell wasn't finished. Phase 1 had been about destroying Tracy and Austin legally and socially. Phase 2 would be about ensuring their complete and permanent ruin. The architect was just getting started. Chapter 4. Foundations Crumble. 6 weeks after the arrests, the case against Tracy Klein and Austin Hurley was proceeding exactly as Russell had designed. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Douglas Burnett, was confident they had enough evidence for first-degree murder conspiracy charges that could result in life sentences. Russell attended every hearing, playing the role of the devastated husband seeking justice. He sat in the front row, often holding hands with Emma when she accompanied him, the picture of a father protecting his child from the consequences of her mother's evil choices. Tracy looked increasingly desperate at each appearance. The designer clothes had been replaced by orange jumpsuits. The carefully styled hair hung limp and unwashed, and the confidence that had once defined her had evaporated entirely. She tried to catch Russell's eye during proceedings, but he looked through her as if she were already dead. Austin was faring even worse. The young man who'd been all swagger and charm was now a hollow-eyed shadow, his attorney struggling to explain away the mounting evidence. His family had driven down from Ohio for the first hearing, but hadn't returned. The shame was too much. Russell's next move was surgical in its precision. He arranged to meet privately with Austin's attorney, Julius Haynes, at a coffee shop downtown. "I wanted to speak with you about your client," Russell said, sliding into the booth across from the young lawyer. "I think there might be a way to resolve this situation that serves everyone's interests." Julius looked suspicious. "Mr. Klein, I'm not sure it's appropriate for us to be having this conversation without my client present. I understand your concern, but I'm here as a father, not just a victim. Emma has been through hell, and I want to minimize her exposure to a lengthy trial." Russell leaned forward, his voice taking on the reasonable tone that had made him successful in business. "Your client was manipulated by my wife. I can see that now. Austin's young, naive, and he fell for an older woman's lies. Tracy convinced him I was abusive, didn't she? That she was trapped and needed rescuing." Julius shifted uncomfortably. Austin had indeed claimed that Tracy had painted her marriage as abusive, describing Russell as controlling and emotionally distant. "I'm willing to consider a plea arrangement," Russell continued. "Austin cooperates fully, testifies against Tracy about how she manipulated him into the relationship and planted the ideas about the insurance money. In exchange, I'll recommend that the prosecutor consider reduced charges." "And what exactly would you want my client to say?" Russell smiled coldly. "The truth. That Tracy was the mastermind, that she seduced him and gradually introduced the idea of getting rid of me. That he went along with it because he believed her lies about being abused." The meeting lasted an hour, and by the end, Julius was considering the proposal. Austin was facing life in prison, but if he testified against Tracy and accepted responsibility for being manipulated, he might see freedom again in 15 years. Russell's psychological warfare against Tracy was more subtle but equally devastating. He arranged for Emma to visit her mother in jail, but only under strict supervision and with carefully planned conversations. "Daddy says you made bad choices, Mommy," Emma said during one visit, her innocent words hitting Tracy like physical blows. "He says that's why you can't come home." Tracy tried to explain, to find words that would help her 7-year-old daughter understand that Mommy wasn't the monster everyone said she was. But how do you explain adultery and frame jobs to a child who still believes in fairy tales? "Sweetheart, Mommy loves you more than anything in the world," Tracy said through tears. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, but I would never hurt Daddy. Never." Emma looked confused. "But Daddy showed me the letter you wrote. You said bad things about him." Tracy felt the walls closing in. Russell was using their daughter as a weapon, poisoning Emma's mind against her own mother with surgical precision. After each visit, Russell would debrief Emma carefully, framing the conversations in ways that supported his narrative. "Mommy seemed upset that we found her letter," Russell would say. "She probably wishes she hadn't written down her plans." Meanwhile, Russell was systematically destroying any potential support systems Tracy might have had. He reached out to her friends from the book club, the yoga class, and their neighborhood social circle. "I wanted you to hear this from me rather than the news," he told Rhonda Berger, Tracy's closest friend. "The police found evidence that Tracy and her friend were planning to kill me, and take Emma. The reactions were predictably shocked. These were suburban women who lived comfortable lives insulated from serious crime. The idea that one of their own could be capable of murder conspiracy was incomprehensible. "I can't believe it," Rhonda said. "Tracy never seemed. I mean, she complained about your work schedule sometimes, but planning murder?" Russell's voice carried just the right note of betrayed confusion. "I keep trying to understand how I missed the signs. How long was she planning this? How could I have been so blind?" One by one, Tracy's friends abandoned her. The woman they'd known for years, the devoted mother, the volunteer at Emma's school, the neighbor who brought casseroles when someone was sick, was replaced in their minds by the monster depicted in the news. The isolation was complete when Russell met with Tracy's sister, Bonita Patrick, who lived 3 states away and had limited contact with the family. "Bonita, I need you to know that I'm not trying to turn the family against Tracy," Russell said during their phone call. "But Emma needs stability right now, and I can't have her exposed to people who might undermine her recovery from this trauma." The subtext was clear: support Tracy and lose access to Emma. Douglas and Francine Chandler were Russell's greatest allies in this campaign. The former judge's reputation and connections gave credibility to Russell's version of events, while Francine's maternal instincts focused entirely on protecting Emma from further harm. "That girl is innocent in all this," Francine told her bridge club, her voice breaking. "Russell is doing everything he can to shield her from the truth about her mother." The custody battle was swift and decisive. With Tracy facing murder conspiracy charges and being held without bail, Russell was awarded full custody with Douglas and Francine as approved caregivers when Russell traveled for work. But Russell wasn't content with legal victory. He wanted psychological destruction. He began visiting Austin in jail, using his status as the victim to gain access for what the guards believed were confrontation sessions meant to provide closure. "She's blaming everything on you," Russell told Austin during their first meeting. "Tracy's attorney is building a defense that portrays you as the predator who seduced her and planted the murder ideas." Austin looked haggard, his muscular frame diminished by jail food and stress. "That's not true. Tracy, she said you were hurting her. She said she was afraid of you." Russell's expression remained calm, sympathetic even. "Austin, I never laid a hand on my wife. We had problems, like any marriage, but violence was never part of our relationship. Tracy lied to you about that, just like she lied about everything else. I don't understand. Why would she? Because she's a narcissist who wanted everything. The security of marriage, the excitement of an affair, and eventually the freedom of widowhood with a nice insurance payout. You were just a tool to her." Russell leaned forward, his voice taking on a fatherly tone. "Son, you're 28 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't throw it away protecting a woman who was using you from day one." The seeds of doubt Russell planted grew over the following weeks. Austin began to question every conversation he'd had with Tracy, every promise she'd made, every moment of their relationship. Had she really loved him, or had he been nothing more than a pawn in a larger game? When Julius Haynes presented the plea agreement that would require Austin to testify against Tracy, Austin was psychologically prepared to accept it. Russell's manipulation of the justice system was masterful. He'd created a situation where the evidence against Tracy was overwhelming, her support system was destroyed, and her co-defendant was being turned against her. The legal proceedings were just a formality at this point. But the architect of this destruction wasn't finished building. Phase 3 would ensure that even if Tracy somehow survived the criminal charges, she would have nothing left to return to. Russell Klein had learned that revenge, like architecture, required a solid foundation. He'd spent months laying that foundation, and now it was time to build the structure that would house Tracy's complete destruction. Chapter 5: The Art of Destruction. 3 months into the legal proceedings, Russell Klein had become something of a celebrity in their suburban community. The sympathetic widower, though technically still married to an incarcerated woman, who was bravely raising his daughter while seeking justice for his family's destruction. The local news had done a feature story on Russell titled "A Father's Strength," showing him volunteering at Emma's school and speaking at a domestic violence awareness event. The irony wasn't lost on Russell. though no one else was in on the joke. Emma was thriving under her father's careful attention. Russell had enrolled her in therapy to help her process the trauma of her mother's betrayal. But he'd selected Dr. Cecilia Larkin, a child psychologist whose methods aligned perfectly with Russell's goals. Emma is remarkably resilient, Dr. Larkin told Russell after their latest session. She's processing the concept that her mother isn't the person she thought she was. It's actually quite healthy for a child her age to understand that adults can make terrible choices. Russell nodded gravely. I just want her to understand that what Tracy did wasn't Emma's fault. Children sometimes blame themselves when parents behave badly. What Dr. Larkin didn't know was that Russell had researched her extensively before choosing her. Cecilia Larkin had strong opinions about parental fitness and believed that children were better served by being honest about a parent's failings rather than maintaining comfortable lies. Under Dr. Larkin's guidance, Emma was learning to articulate her feelings about her mother's bad choices. The 7-year-old was developing a vocabulary around betrayal, consequences, and the importance of honesty that would serve Russell's purposes perfectly when the custody evaluations were completed. Meanwhile, Russell's campaign against Austin Hurley had reached its critical phase. He convinced the young man to accept a plea deal that would reduce his sentence from life to 15 years in exchange for testifying against Tracy. But Russell wasn't satisfied with Austin's cooperation. He wanted the man's complete psychological breakdown. Russell's jail visits had become weekly events, each one designed to chip away at Austin's remaining sanity and self-respect. Tracy's been telling people you've forced yourself on her, Russell informed Austin during one visit. She's claiming the affair wasn't consensual, that you threatened her if she didn't comply. Austin's face went white. That's not true. We were in love. She said she was going to leave you for me. Did she? Or did she say whatever she needed to say to keep you available for sex? Russell's voice was clinical, detached. Austin, I've been married to Tracy for 9 years. I know how she operates. She tells people what they want to hear, and she's very convincing about it. Russell pulled out his phone and showed Austin a photo, one of Tracy laughing with Russell at a charity event, taken just days before one of her supposed miserable marriage conversations with Austin. This was taken the night before she told you I'd been cruel to her about some work event. Does she look like an abused woman to you? Austin stared at the photo, his worldview crumbling. The woman laughing in Russell's arms looked nothing like the trapped, desperate wife he thought he'd been rescuing. She's been manipulating both of us, Russell continued. The difference is, I figured it out before she could destroy me completely. The psychological pressure Russell applied was relentless and sophisticated. He understood that Austin's sense of identity was built around being a protector, a rescuer of women in distress. By systematically destroying that self-image, Russell was removing the foundation of Austin's will to fight. Your family back in Ohio, Russell said during another visit. They've been getting some interesting mail lately. Austin looked up sharply. What kind of mail? Court documents, news clippings, photos. I thought they should understand exactly what kind of man their son has become. The cruelty was precise. Russell had indeed been sending Austin's family carefully curated information about the case, ensuring they received the most damaging interpretations of their son's actions. Austin's parents, simple people who ran a small farm, were devastated by the shame their son had brought to the family name. They won't take my calls anymore, Austin whispered. Can you blame them? You conspired to murder a husband and father. You helped plan to steal a child from her home. What parent wants to be associated with that? Russell's voice carried false sympathy. But it's not too late to do the right thing. Testify honestly about how Tracy manipulated you. Accept responsibility for your poor judgment, and maybe someday your family can forgive you. The plea negotiation was Russell's masterpiece of legal manipulation. He met with District Attorney Douglas Burnett to discuss the terms, positioning himself as the magnanimous victim willing to show mercy to the younger, more easily manipulated defendant. I don't want to see Austin's life completely destroyed, Russell told Burnett. He's young, and Tracy is an expert manipulator. If he's willing to tell the truth about how she seduced him into this scheme, I think justice will be served with a 15-year sentence. Burnett was impressed by Russell's apparent forgiveness. That's very generous of you, Mr. Klein. Most men in your position would want maximum sentences for both defendants. I'm thinking about Emma, Russell replied. A long trial with both defendants fighting the charges will be traumatic for her. If Austin pleads out and testifies against Tracy, we can resolve this more quickly. What Burnett didn't understand was that Russell wanted Austin's testimony because it would eliminate any chance of Tracy mounting a successful defense. With her co-defendant confirming the prosecution's narrative, Tracy would have no credible way to claim innocence. The strategy worked perfectly. Austin's attorney presented the plea deal as their best option, and after weeks of psychological pressure from Russell's visits, Austin was ready to accept any path that might lead to eventual redemption. The day Austin signed the plea agreement, Russell felt a deep satisfaction. Not because justice was being served, but because another piece of his architectural revenge was falling into place. Tracy's isolation was now complete. Her co-defendant had turned against her, her family had abandoned her friends had rejected her, and her daughter was being systematically reprogrammed to see her as a monster. But Russell's most devastating move was yet to come. He arranged a meeting with Tracy's defense attorney, Madeline Sanford, ostensibly to discuss a possible plea arrangement for Tracy as well. My client maintains her innocence, Madeline told Russell in the courthouse conference room. She claims she's never seen these documents before, that the handwriting analysis is wrong, that someone is framing her. Russell nodded sympathetically. Madeline, I understand that Tracy needs to maintain her innocence for psychological reasons. Accepting that she planned to murder me and kidnap Emma would probably break her completely. Are you saying you believe she's innocent? I'm saying that I loved Tracy for 9 years, and I want to believe that somewhere inside her is the woman I married. If she's willing to accept responsibility for the affair and the financial fraud, and if she agrees to relinquish all parental rights to Emma, I might be willing to consider supporting a plea to lesser charges. Madeline leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of lesser charges? Fraud, conspiracy, reckless endangerment. Maybe she could be out in 7 to 10 years instead of life. But Russell's offer came with conditions that were designed to be unacceptable to any mother. Complete termination of parental rights, a restraining order preventing any contact with Emma, and a public admission of guilt that would destroy any remaining shred of her reputation. She'd never see her daughter again? Madeline asked. Emma has been through enough trauma. Having a mother who conspired to murder her father isn't something a child should have to live with. When Madeline presented the offer to Tracy, the reaction was exactly what Russell had anticipated. I'd rather die in prison than give up my rights to Emma, Tracy said through tears. And I'm not admitting to crimes I didn't commit. The refusal was perfect for Russell's purposes. It would be presented to the jury as evidence of Tracy's continued selfishness and lack of remorse. What kind of mother would choose pride over a chance to someday have a relationship with her child? As Austin's testimony date approached, Russell made one final visit to the broken young man. Tomorrow, you'll have a chance to tell the truth, Russell said, to explain how Tracy manipulated you, how she played on your emotions, and convinced you to participate in her scheme. Austin nodded miserably. I just want this to be over. It will be, Russell assured him. And Austin, when you're released in 15 years, you'll still be young enough to build a real life. A life based on honesty instead of lies. Russell left the jail feeling a deep sense of completion. The trial was a formality now. Tracy would be convicted, Austin would serve his reduced sentence, and Russell would emerge as the heroic survivor who'd protected his daughter from a mother's ultimate betrayal. But the architect wasn't quite finished with his blueprint. There was one final element to put in place, one last detail that would ensure his revenge was not just complete, but permanent. Russell Klein had always believed that the best structures were built to last forever. Chapter 6. The Perfect Witness. The morning of Austin Hurley's testimony arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Russell think of new beginnings. He dressed carefully for court. A navy suit that conveyed both professionalism and quiet grief, a tie that Emma had given him for Father's Day, and a wedding ring he still wore despite everything. Emma wouldn't be in court today. Russell had arranged for her to spend the day with her grandparents, carefully explaining that Mommy's friend would be talking to the judge about the bad things they'd planned together. The 7-year-old had nodded solemnly, her trust in her father's version of events absolute. The courthouse was packed with media and curious onlookers. The case had captured the public imagination, a beautiful suburban mother and her young lover plotting to murder her successful husband. It was the kind of story that sold newspapers and generated online discussions about the darkness lurking behind perfect picket fences. Russell took his usual seat in the front row, directly in Tracy's line of sight. She looked fragile in her orange jumpsuit, her once perfect blonde hair now grown out and showing dark roots. When their eyes met, he saw desperation there, and something else, a growing realization that the trap she was in had been constructed with architectural precision. Austin took the stand, looking like a different person from the confident personal trainer Russell had first observed at the gym. Prison had hollowed out his cheeks and dulled his eyes, but it was the psychological pressure that had truly broken him. District Attorney Douglas Burnett led Austin through his testimony with careful precision, each question designed to build the narrative of manipulation and murder conspiracy. Mr. Hurley, how did your relationship with Mrs. Klein begin? Austin's voice was barely above a whisper. She started coming to my classes at the gym. She seemed sad, lonely. She said her husband was cold, that he didn't appreciate her. Did she tell you she was unhappy in her marriage? Yes. She said Russell was controlling, that he monitored her spending and questioned where she went. She made it sound like she was trapped. Russell maintained his composure, but inside he felt the satisfaction of watching his carefully constructed narrative unfold. Every detail Austin recounted had been fed to Tracy by Russell himself through his own behavior and calculated comments. When did the relationship become physical? After about 6 weeks. She said she needed to feel wanted, appreciated. She said Russell made her feel like she was just there to take care of Emma and look good at his business events. The testimony continued for 3 hours, with Austin describing their affair in clinical detail. But the most damaging testimony came when Burnett moved to the alleged murder plot. Mr. Hurley, did Mrs. Klein ever discuss her husband's life insurance policy? Yes. She said he'd recently increased it to $2 million. She thought it was strange because he'd never shown much interest in life insurance before. Russell had indeed increased his policy, but only after planning the idea with Tracy that he was worried about business rivals who might want to harm him. She'd encouraged him to protect his family, never realizing she was being maneuvered into a position where her knowledge of the policy would later seem suspicious. Did Mrs. Klein suggest that you and she could be together permanently if her husband was no longer alive? Austin nodded miserably. She said Russell would never agree to a divorce because he was too proud. She said he'd rather destroy her than let her be happy with someone else. Did she propose a specific plan for her husband's death? This was the crucial moment, and Russell leaned forward slightly to hear Austin's response. She said it had to look like an accident. She talked about his morning runs, how he always took the same route through the park. She said if something happened to him there, like a mugging gone wrong, no one would suspect anything. The courtroom was silent as Austin described plans that existed only in Russell's imagination, but had been carefully fed to Tracy through staged conversations and planted suggestions. Russell had indeed started running in the park, and he made sure Tracy knew his route and schedule. Mr. Hurley, did you agree to participate in this plan? Yes. I thought I was helping her escape from an abusive situation. She made me believe that Russell was dangerous, that he might hurt her or Emma if he found out about us. The defense attorney, Madeline Sanford, had a nearly impossible task in cross-examination. Austin's testimony was internally consistent and supported by the physical evidence. Her only strategy was to suggest that he was lying to reduce his sentence, but Austin's obvious emotional distress made him appear credible. Mr. Hurley, isn't it true that you're only testifying against Mrs. Klein because the prosecution promised you a reduced sentence? I'm testifying because I want to tell the truth about what happened. Tracy manipulated me, but I was stupid enough to go along with it. I deserve to be punished for that. You claim Mrs. Klein was the mastermind of this alleged plot, but isn't it possible that you were the one who suggested killing her husband? Austin looked directly at Tracy for the first time during his testimony. I loved her. I thought she loved me. I would have done anything she asked, including things I knew were wrong. That's on me, but the ideas came from her. When Austin's testimony concluded, Russell watched Tracy's reaction carefully. She was shaking her head slightly, mouthing the word no over and over. The woman who'd once seemed so confident in her ability to manipulate situations was finally understanding how completely she'd been outmaneuvered. During the lunch break, Russell encountered Madeline Sanford in the courthouse hallway. Mr. Klein, I need to ask you directly. Are you certain my client is guilty of these charges? Russell's expression was perfectly calibrated. Madeline, I know this is difficult for you. Tracy can be very convincing when she wants something, but the evidence speaks for itself. The evidence that you discovered, the handwriting that matches hers, the bank account that has her signature, the conversations that happen to be recorded by your security system. Russell nodded sadly. I wish none of this were true. I wish I could believe that someone else was responsible. But Tracy made choices that put our entire family at risk. What Madeline couldn't know was that every piece of evidence she'd mentioned had been meticulously crafted by Russell over months of patient work. The handwriting had been practiced until it was indistinguishable from Tracy's. The bank signatures had been forged using techniques Russell had learned from a former client who was a document examiner. The recordings had been edited and manipulated to support the narrative Russell wanted to tell. The afternoon session focused on the physical evidence, the letter, the bank records, the photographs. Each piece was presented as if it were an independent corroboration of Austin's testimony, when in reality all of it had been manufactured by the same architect. When court adjourned for the day, Russell approached the prosecutor. How do you think it went? He asked Burnett. Very well. Austin was credible, and his testimony corroborates all our physical evidence. Your wife's attorney is competent, but she doesn't have much to work with. Russell nodded. I just want this to be over. Emma needs closure, and frankly, so do I. That evening, Russell sat in his study reviewing the day's events with the satisfaction of a craftsman admiring his work. Austin's testimony had been perfect, detailed enough to be convincing, emotional enough to be sympathetic, and consistent enough to be unshakable. But Russell's masterpiece wasn't the testimony itself. It was the psychological manipulation that had made Austin believe every word he was saying. The young man genuinely thought Tracy had manipulated him into a murder plot because Russell had spent months convincing him that was the truth. The real genius of Russell's plan was that it contained enough elements of truth to be believable. Tracy had been unfaithful. She had complained about their marriage. She had known about the insurance policy. Austin had been willing to do anything to please her. Russell had simply taken those true elements and constructed a narrative around them that served his purposes. It was like architectural drafting. You start with the foundation of reality and build the structure you want on top of it. As Russell prepared for bed, he thought about the next day's proceedings. The prosecution would rest its case, and Madeline Sanford would begin her defense. But what defense could she mount against evidence that appeared ironclad and testimony that seemed heartfelt? Tracy's fate was sealed. She would be convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life in prison. Austin would serve his 15 years and emerge a broken man who would never fully recover from his role in destroying a family. And Russell would continue his life as the heroic single father who'd protected his daughter from a mother's ultimate betrayal. The architect had built his masterpiece, and it was a thing of terrible beauty. Chapter 7. The defense crumbles. Tracy Klein's defense lasted exactly 2.5 days, which was longer than most court observers had expected. Madeline Sanford fought valiantly for her client, but she was battling against evidence that appeared unshakable and testimony that had left little room for reasonable doubt. The defense strategy centered on the argument that Tracy was being framed, but without being able to identify who would have the means and motive to construct such an elaborate deception. The theory sounded like desperate speculation. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Madeline said in her opening statement, my client is the victim of a sophisticated frame job. Someone with intimate knowledge of her life, her handwriting, and her daily routines has constructed a web of false evidence designed to destroy her. Russell sat in the gallery, his expression one of pained attention. To the observers, he appeared to be a man listening to his wife's attorney grasp at straws to avoid accountability. Only Russell knew that Madeline was actually closer to the truth than anyone else in the courtroom. The defense's first witness was a handwriting expert named Dr. Troy Piper, whom Madeline had hoped would cast doubt on the authenticity of the letter allegedly written by Tracy. Dr. Piper, in your analysis of a letter attributed to Mrs. Klein, did you find any evidence that it was forged? The handwriting is extremely consistent with known samples of Mrs. Klein's writing. However, there are some subtle anomalies that could suggest either forgery or writing under stress. District Attorney Burnett was ready for this line of defense. Dr. Piper, isn't it true that handwriting can change when someone is writing about emotionally charged subjects? Yes, stress and emotional state can affect handwriting characteristics. And if someone were planning to murder their spouse, that would certainly qualify as an emotionally charged situation, wouldn't it? The expert had to agree, and Russell watched Madeline's first line of defense crumble under cross-examination. The defense's second witness was Tracy's sister, Bonita Patrick, who testified via video link from her home in Kansas. Madeline had hoped Bonita would provide character testimony that would make the murder conspiracy seem implausible. Ms. Patrick, in your experience with your sister, have you ever known her to be violent or vindictive? Never. Tracy was one of the gentlest people I know. She wouldn't hurt a fly. But Burnett's cross-examination revealed that Bonita hadn't spoken to Tracy in over 6 months and had no knowledge of her marriage problems or the affair. Ms. Patrick, when was the last time you had a meaningful conversation with your sister about her marriage? It's been, well, probably over a year. We don't talk very often. So you wouldn't know if Mrs. Klein was unhappy in her marriage or if she was having an affair? No, I suppose I wouldn't. Russell had deliberately limited Tracy's contact with her extended family over the years, subtly discouraging visits and phone calls. By the time of the trial, no one in Tracy's family had enough recent knowledge of her life to provide meaningful character testimony. The defense's most desperate move was putting Tracy herself on the stand. Russell had been waiting for this moment, curious to see if his wife would finally understand the scope of what had been done to her. Tracy was sworn in wearing the same orange jumpsuit she'd worn for months, but Madeline had arranged for her to have her hair done by the jail's beautician. She looked more like the woman Russell had married, which made her claims of innocence seem more credible. Mrs. Klein, did you write the letter that allegedly details a plan to kill your husband? No, I did not. I've never seen that letter before in my life. Did you open a secret bank account to fund a murder plot? No. I opened an account to help Austin with his business plans, but there was never any discussion of hurting Russell. Did you have an affair with Austin Hurley? Tracy's voice broke slightly. Yes, I was unfaithful to my husband, and I regret that deeply, but I never wanted to hurt him. Russell watched Tracy's testimony with professional interest. She was actually quite good on the stand, sincere, remorseful about the affair, but adamant about her innocence regarding the murder plot. If the physical evidence hadn't been so damning, she might have been believable. Mrs. Klein, Austin Hurley testified that you approached him with the idea of killing your husband. Is that true? No, it's not true. Austin is lying to save himself. I loved him, and I thought he loved me, but he's willing to destroy me to reduce his sentence. Madeline was building toward her closing argument theme, that Austin was the real mastermind who had manipulated Tracy, not the other way around. It was a reasonable strategy given the circumstances, but it required the jury to believe that Austin's emotional breakdown on the stand had been an act. The cross-examination was where Russell's planning truly shone. District Attorney Burnett had been thoroughly prepared for every possible defense strategy. Mrs. Klein, you admit you lied to your husband about your whereabouts for months during your affair? Yes. You admit you took money from your family's accounts to give to Mr. Hurley without your husband's knowledge? Yes, but it was for his business, not for any murder plot. You admit you discussed your husband's life insurance policy with Mr. Hurley? I mentioned it, yes, but not in the context Austin described. So you're admitting to systematic deception, financial fraud, and intimate discussions about your husband's death benefit with your lover. But you want the jury to believe you drew the line at murder? Tracy's credibility crumbled under the weight of her admitted lies and deceptions. Even her claims of innocence regarding the murder plot seemed less believable when viewed against the pattern of dishonesty she'd established in other areas. Russell's favorite moment came when Burnett questioned Tracy about her knowledge of Russell's daily routines. "Mrs. Klein, your husband testified that you encouraged him to increase his life insurance because you were concerned about his safety. Is that true?" "Yes, I was worried about him. He'd been working on some controversial projects, and he mentioned that some people weren't happy with his designs. And you knew his running route through the park?" "Of course. We discussed it many times. I worried about him running alone so early in the morning." What Tracy didn't realize was that by confirming her knowledge of Russell's routines and her encouragement regarding the insurance, she was corroborating key elements of the prosecution's case. Russell had fed her those concerns about his safety specifically so she would later appear to have inside knowledge that supported the murder plot. The final nail in the coffin came when Burnett asked about the night of discovery at her parents' house. "Mrs. Klein, your daughter was the one who noticed the envelope under the table. Are you suggesting that your 7-year-old child was part of some conspiracy to frame you?" "No, of course not. Emma is innocent. But someone put that envelope there knowing she would find it." "Who, Mrs. Klein? Who would have access to your parents' house, knowledge of your family dinner plans, and the ability to plant evidence without being detected?" Tracy looked directly at Russell for the first time during her testimony. In that moment, Russell saw recognition dawn in her eyes. She finally understood who had orchestrated her destruction. Tracy started to speak, then stopped. She couldn't accuse Russell without sounding completely delusional. He was the victim, the grieving husband, the protective father. No one would believe that he had framed his own wife for attempted murder. "I don't know," Tracy finished weakly. Russell smiled slightly, a gesture so brief that only Tracy caught it. But it was enough to confirm what she just realized. When Tracy was dismissed from the stand, she looked like a woman who had finally understood the full scope of her doom. Russell had not only destroyed her marriage and her reputation, he had constructed a legal and social reality where she was powerless to defend herself against his accusations. The closing arguments were anticlimactic. Burnett methodically reviewed the evidence and Austin's testimony, painting a picture of a cold-blooded conspiracy that had been stopped just in time by a father's determination to protect his child. Madeline's closing was passionate but futile. She argued that the evidence was too neat, the timeline too convenient, and Austin's testimony too self-serving to be credible. But without being able to offer an alternative explanation that made sense, her arguments sounded like the desperate attempts of a defense attorney who knew her client was doomed. Russell left the courthouse that day knowing the jury would convict. The only question was whether they would recommend life in prison or the death penalty. As he drove home to Emma, Russell reflected on the perfection of his achievement. Tracy would spend the rest of her life in prison for crimes she didn't commit, but crimes that everyone believed she had committed. Austin would serve 15 years and emerge as a broken shell of his former self. And Russell would raise Emma to understand that her mother had been a monster who had tried to destroy their family. The architect had built something unprecedented, a revenge so complete and so perfectly constructed that even its victims couldn't fully comprehend its scope. Chapter 8. The Verdict. The jury deliberated for 8 hours across 2 days. Russell spent the time maintaining his routine, taking Emma to school, meeting with clients, and appearing to live the life of a man waiting for justice to be served. But inside, he was running calculations, considering contingencies, and preparing for the final phase of his plan. Emma had been asking more questions about the trial lately, her 7-year-old mind trying to process why Mommy was in jail and why Daddy looked sad all the time. "When will we know if Mommy did the bad things?" she asked over breakfast on the morning of the second day of deliberations. Russell carefully buttered her toast, using the mundane task to mask his satisfaction. "Soon, sweetheart. The people on the jury are thinking very carefully about all the things they heard in court. Will Mommy come home if they decide she didn't do the bad things? This was the question Russell had been preparing for. Emma, sometimes grown-ups do things that hurt other people, even when they love those people. Mommy made choices that hurt our family, and now she has to face the consequences of those choices. It was a masterful non-answer that left Emma with the impression that Tracy's guilt was not in question, only the severity of her punishment. At 3:47 p.m. on the second day, Russell received the call that the jury had reached a verdict. He arranged for Emma to stay with her grandparents and drove to the courthouse with the measured pace of a man who wasn't entirely sure what news awaited him. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. The case had captured national attention as an example of suburban evil hidden behind perfect facades. Russell took his usual seat in the front row, noting that Tracy looked smaller somehow, as if the weeks of imprisonment and public scrutiny had physically diminished her. When the jury foreman stood to read the verdict, the courtroom fell silent except for the sound of Tracy's quiet sobbing. We, the jury, find the defendant, Tracy Chandler Klein, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. Russell closed his eyes briefly, not in relief, but in satisfaction at another precisely executed element of his design. We, the jury, find the defendant, Tracy Chandler Klein, guilty of conspiracy to commit kidnapping in the first degree. Tracy's sobbing grew louder, and Madeline Sanford put a comforting hand on her client's shoulder. We, the jury, find the defendant, Tracy Chandler Klein, guilty of fraud in the first degree. When the foreman finished reading all 7 guilty verdicts, Russell stood with the rest of the courtroom as the judge dismissed the jury. He made eye contact with several jurors, nodding his appreciation for their service with the dignity expected from a victim who had finally received justice. Outside the courthouse, Russell gave a brief statement to the assembled media. "I want to thank the jury for their careful consideration of this case," he said, his voice steady but carrying undertones of grief. "My focus now is on healing and moving forward with my daughter. Emma has been through tremendous trauma, and she deserves the chance to grow up without the shadow of her mother's choices hanging over her life." A reporter called out, "Mr. Klein, do you feel justice has been served?" Russell paused, as if considering the weight of the question. "Justice for our family means that Emma will grow up safe, knowing that her father will always protect her from people who would harm her. In that sense, yes, justice has been served." The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, giving Russell time to prepare for the final act of his revenge. During those weeks, he met with victim impact coordinators, drafted his statement for the court, and continued the delicate work of reshaping Emma's understanding of her family's history. He also made one final visit to Austin Hurley, who was awaiting transfer to state prison to begin serving his 15-year sentence. "I wanted to see you before you were transferred," Russell told the broken young man, "to thank you for telling the truth about what Tracy did to both of us." Austin looked up with hollow eyes. "I keep thinking about how she played me, how she made me believe I was saving her when really she was using me to help plan your murder." Russell nodded sympathetically. "Tracy is an expert manipulator. If it makes you feel any better, she fooled me for 9 years before I started to see who she really was. Do you think she ever loved me at all?" The question was pathetic in its neediness, and Russell almost felt sorry for the man he'd systematically destroyed. "Almost. I think Tracy loves only herself," Russell said. "Everyone else is just a tool to get what she wants." When Russell left the jail that day, he knew Austin would spend the next 15 years replaying their conversations, becoming more convinced with each passing year that he had been the victim of a master manipulator rather than the unknowing pawn in someone else's game of revenge. The sentencing hearing drew an even larger crowd than the verdict. Russell had prepared a victim impact statement that he'd practiced until every pause and inflection conveyed the perfect balance of pain and strength. "Your Honor," Russell began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, "Tracy Klein was my wife for 9 years and the mother of my daughter. For most of that time, I believed I knew who she was. I thought I was married to a loving woman who shared my values and my commitment to our family. Russell paused, looking directly at Tracy for the first time since the trial began. The woman sitting before you is a stranger to me. The Tracy I thought I married would never have betrayed our family. She would never have conspired to murder the father of her child. She would never have planned to steal our daughter from the only stable home she's ever known. Tracy was crying openly now, but Russell continued with clinical precision. Emma asks me every day when Mommy is coming home. How do I tell a 7-year-old that Mommy planned to kill Daddy? How do I explain that the person she trusted most in the world was willing to destroy her family for selfish desires? Russell's voice broke slightly, a calculated display of emotion that had taken weeks to perfect. Your Honor, I'm not asking for vengeance. I'm asking for protection. Emma needs to grow up knowing that the people who claim to love her will never betray that trust. She needs to understand that actions have consequences, and that even people we love must be held accountable when they choose evil over good. When Russell finished his statement, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. He had painted himself as the noble victim, Tracy as the manipulative predator, and Emma as the innocent child who needed protection from her own mother. Judge Wendell Warren, no relation to Russell's attorney, had presided over hundreds of sentencing hearings, but this case had clearly affected him personally. Mrs. Klein, the judge said, his voice heavy with disgust, you have committed crimes that strike at the very foundation of family and society. You betrayed your husband's trust, endangered your child's welfare, and conspired to commit the ultimate crime against the man who provided for and protected you. Tracy tried to speak, to offer some final plea for mercy or understanding, but the judge cut her off. You had every opportunity to choose a different path. You could have sought marriage counseling, filed for divorce, or simply ended your affair and recommitted to your family. Instead, you chose murder and kidnapping as solutions to your marital problems. Russell watched Tracy's face as the judge pronounced sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder conspiracy, 25 years for the kidnapping conspiracy, and 10 years for fraud, all sentences to run consecutively. Tracy Klein would die in prison. As the bailiffs led Tracy away in shackles, she looked back at Russell one final time. In her eyes, he saw complete understanding of what had been done to her, and complete helplessness to change it. Russell left the courthouse that day as a widower, though technically still married to a woman who would spend the rest of her life in a maximum security prison. Emma would grow up believing her mother was a monster who had tried to destroy their family. That evening, Russell sat in his study reviewing architectural plans for a new project while Emma played in the next room. The life he'd constructed around them was perfect now. No complications, no betrayals, no messy emotions to navigate. He had built the ultimate structure, a reality where he was the hero, Tracy was the villain, and Emma was the innocent victim who needed his protection. It was a masterpiece of psychological architecture, and it would last for the rest of their lives. Russell Klein had learned that revenge, properly executed, wasn't about destroying your enemies. It was about constructing a new reality where your enemies destroyed themselves, and you emerged as the righteous survivor. Chapter 9. The Perfect Life. 5 years had passed since Tracy Klein's sentencing, and Russell had constructed what appeared to be the perfect life from the ashes of his family's destruction. Emma, now 12, was thriving academically and socially, with no apparent trauma from her mother's betrayal. Russell had received the Father of the Year award from the city's Family Services Organization and had been featured in parenting magazines as an example of how single fathers could provide stability for their children. The architectural firm had expanded into 3 states, largely due to the sympathy and admiration Russell had garnered as the man who'd survived his wife's attempt to murder him. Clients trusted him not just with their buildings, but with their stories of family difficulties and business challenges. Russell Klein had become the go-to architect for people who needed to rebuild their lives. Emma's relationship with her paternal grandparents, Douglas and Francine Chandler, had evolved exactly as Russell had planned. They saw themselves as her protectors against the truth about her mother, and they competed with Russell to provide her with love and stability. Emma was surrounded by adults who were invested in maintaining the narrative that her father was a hero and her mother was a monster. "Daddy, Jessica's mom asked me about Mommy again today," Emma said over dinner one evening. At 12, she was developing the angular features that reminded Russell of Tracy, but her personality was pure Klein, analytical, controlled, and loyal to family. "What did you tell her?" Russell asked, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "I told her that Mommy made bad choices, and now she's in prison for trying to hurt people. Jessica's mom said she was sorry, and I told her it was okay because you take better care of me than Mommy ever did." Russell smiled with genuine warmth. "You handled that very well, sweetheart. Some people don't understand that families can be better after removing dangerous people from them." This was the conversation Russell had been cultivating for 5 years. Emma didn't remember her early childhood with Tracy clearly, and the narrative Russell had constructed had replaced most of her positive memories. In Emma's mind, her mother had always been unstable, selfish, and potentially dangerous. The few times Emma asked about visiting Tracy in prison, Russell had gently explained that it wouldn't be healthy for either of them. "Mommy is still the same person who planned to hurt our family," he would say. "She might try to manipulate you or lie to you about what really happened. My job is to protect you from that kind of psychological damage." Emma had stopped asking about visits years ago. Russell's social life had evolved as well. He dated occasionally, always women who were impressed by his devotion to Emma and his tragic backstory. He never let any relationship develop too seriously, claiming that Emma needed his full attention during her formative years. The truth was that Russell had no interest in remarrying. He had learned that marriage required trust and vulnerability, and he was incapable of either. The systematic destruction of Tracy had revealed something fundamental about his own nature. He was most comfortable when he had complete control over his environment and the people in it. Austin Hurley had been released from prison the previous year after serving 10 years of his 15-year sentence for good behavior. Russell had kept track of his former enemy through various sources, and the reports were exactly what he'd expected. Austin had emerged from prison as a broken man. His family in Ohio wanted nothing to do with him. His prospects for employment were limited by his criminal record, and his confidence had been completely shattered by years of believing he'd been manipulated into a murder conspiracy. Russell had arranged for one of his business associates to hire Austin for manual labor at a construction site, not out of charity, but because he wanted to observe the final results of his psychological warfare. Austin worked as a day laborer, lived in a halfway house, and spent his evenings at Alcoholics Anonymous meetings trying to make sense of how his life had gone so wrong. The man who had once been confident enough to seduce another man's wife now flinched when spoken to directly and apologized for taking up space in conversations. Russell's masterpiece was complete. The only loose thread in Russell's perfect construction was Tracy herself. She had spent 5 years in maximum security prison, and the reports Russell received through his connections in the legal community suggested that she had not adapted well to incarceration. Tracy had been attacked twice by other inmates who viewed her as a child-endangering monster. She spent most of her time in protective custody, with limited human contact and no possibility of appeal. Her initial claims of innocence had been replaced by a kind of catatonic acceptance of her fate. The prison psychologist's reports, which Russell obtained through carefully cultivated relationships, indicated that Tracy showed signs of severe depression and had made multiple suicide attempts. She rarely spoke to anyone and spent her days staring at the walls of her cell. Russell felt no sympathy for her suffering. Tracy had chosen to betray their family, and this was simply the natural consequence of that choice. On the 5th anniversary of Tracy's sentencing, Russell took Emma to dinner at the same restaurant where he'd proposed to Tracy 15 years earlier. It was a deliberate choice, a way of reclaiming a space that had once held significance in his relationship with a woman who was now dying slowly in a prison cell. "Daddy, do you ever miss being married?" Emma asked as they waited for dessert. Russell considered the question carefully. "I miss the idea of being married to someone trustworthy, but I learned that some people are better at pretending to be good than actually being good. Do you think you'll ever get married again?" "Maybe someday, when you're older and don't need as much of my attention. But I'd be very careful to choose someone who shared our values and who would never try to hurt our family." Emma nodded seriously. I think you should only marry someone who loves me too, not just someone who pretends to love me to get to you. Russell's smile was genuine. That's very wise, sweetheart. You're already better at reading people than I was at your age. This was the ultimate victory. Not just Tracy's destruction, but Emma's transformation into someone who would never make Tracy's mistakes. Russell was raising a daughter who understood that loyalty was paramount, that betrayal was unforgivable, and that some people deserved everything bad that happened to them. Later that evening, Russell sat in his study reviewing blueprints for a new residential development. The project was massive, 200 homes for families looking to build perfect lives in a controlled environment. Russell would design their houses, their community spaces, and their security systems. He understood now that his true calling wasn't just architecture, it was social engineering on a grand scale. He was in the business of creating perfect structures for perfect lives, and he had the skills to eliminate anything that threatened that perfection. As he worked, Russell thought about Tracy, sitting in her cell 500 miles away, probably staring at the ceiling and wondering how her life had gone so catastrophically wrong. She would never understand that her destruction hadn't been the result of bad luck or poor choices. It had been the inevitable consequence of betraying Russell Klein. Emma was upstairs doing homework, secure in the knowledge that her father would always protect her from people like her mother. She would grow up strong, successful, and completely loyal to the man who had saved her from the woman who had given birth to her. Russell Klein had built the perfect life from the ruins of an imperfect marriage. He had eliminated betrayal, created absolute loyalty, and constructed a reality where he was the unquestioned hero of his own story. It was his greatest architectural achievement, and it would last forever. The phone rang, interrupting his work. It was Douglas Chandler, calling to check on Emma and to share news from his legal connections. Russell, my boy, I thought you should know. I heard from a friend who works in the prison system. Tracy has been moved to the psychiatric wing. Apparently, she's been having some kind of breakdown. Russell's pen paused over his blueprints. Is she dangerous? No, nothing like that. She's been claiming that she's innocent, that someone framed her. Complete delusion, of course. The psychiatrists think she's having trouble accepting responsibility for what she did. Russell smiled. Even in her madness, Tracy was still trying to tell the truth. But truth was just another construction material, and Russell had built something more powerful than truth. He had built consensus reality. That's sad, but not surprising, Russell told his former father-in-law. Some people would rather go insane than accept the consequences of their actions. Exactly. Well, I just wanted you to know in case it ever comes up with Emma. Though I don't see why it would. Thank you for keeping me informed, Douglas. Emma and I both appreciate how you and Francine have supported us through all this. After ending the call, Russell returned to his blueprints with renewed focus. Tracy's final breakdown was just confirmation that his construction was complete and permanent. He had destroyed her so thoroughly that even she no longer trusted her own memories of what had actually happened. Russell Klein had built the perfect revenge, and now he was living in the perfect life that revenge had made possible. The architect's work was done. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, Fractured Foundation. Caleb Wolf stood at the edge of the firing range, the desert sun beating down on his weathered face. At 42, his body still maintained the hardened physique of his Special Forces days, though flecks of silver had begun to invade his dark hair. 15 years had passed since he'd left Delta Force, but the skills remained, muscle memory that wouldn't fade. You're still a damn good shot, remarked Lenny, the range owner and one of the few people Caleb considered a friend. Military never really leaves you, does it? Caleb ejected the magazine and set the pistol down. Some things stick with you forever. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Tanya. Again. Their marriage had deteriorated over the past year into something unrecognizable. Gone was the woman who'd supported him through 3 tours in Afghanistan and his transition to civilian life. In her place was someone distant, irritable, and increasingly absent. I should head home, Caleb said, gathering his gear. Brady's having friends over today. Brady was their 16-year-old son, the one pure thing in Caleb's life. Despite the growing disconnect with Tanya, Caleb had maintained a strong relationship with Brady, teaching him everything from wilderness survival to automotive repair. Unlike his father, Brady had a gentle soul, smart, compassionate, more interested in biology than battlefield tactics. Caleb was proud of that. Give the kid my best, Lenny called as Caleb headed toward his truck. The drive home took Caleb through River Point, a small town nestled against the mountains where he'd settled after leaving the military. He'd started a successful security consulting business, providing training to corporate clients and occasionally private protection services. The work wasn't as adrenaline-fueled as his former life, but it paid well and gave him time with his family. As he pulled into the driveway of their 2-story home, Caleb noticed Tanya's car was gone. She'd mentioned a lunch with colleagues from the real estate office where she worked, but something felt off. Her excuses for being away had multiplied lately. Work meetings, gym sessions, shopping trips with friends Caleb had never met. Brady greeted him at the door, his lanky frame leaning against the doorway. Hey, Dad, where are those friends you were having over? Caleb asked, setting his range bag down. Brady shrugged. They canceled. Where's Mom? Work thing, Caleb replied, studying his son's expression. Everything okay? Yeah. Brady hesitated. Dad, can I ask you something? They moved to the kitchen where Caleb grabbed 2 sodas from the refrigerator. What's on your mind? Is everything okay between you and Mom? Brady's eyes, so much like Tanya's, looked troubled. Caleb considered lying, but had always been straight with his son. We're going through a rough patch. Adults sometimes do, but we'll figure it out. Brady nodded, unconvinced. She gets a lot of calls and texts. She always leaves the room to answer them. A cold weight settled in Caleb's stomach. He'd noticed the same behavior, but had forced himself not to jump to conclusions. Military training had taught him to gather intelligence before taking action. I'm sure it's just work, Caleb said, not believing it himself. There's something else, Brady added quietly. Last week, when you were in Denver for that conference, Mom had someone over. A man. I came home early from school because of a power outage, and they were in the living room. She introduced him as Russell, a client, but they seemed close. He left really quickly after I showed up. The cold weight in Caleb's stomach hardened, but his face remained impassive, another skill from his military days. Did she mention this Russell before? Never, Brady said. And Dad? I saw the same car parked down the street yesterday, like they were being careful not to park in front. Caleb nodded slowly. Thanks for telling me. Don't worry about it. Okay? Adult stuff. After Brady went upstairs, Caleb sat alone at the kitchen table, his mind processing this new information with tactical precision. If Tanya was having an affair, he needed confirmation, not suspicion. In his former life, Caleb had tracked high-value targets across hostile territory. Finding out if his wife was cheating should be straightforward by comparison. When Tanya returned home that evening, Caleb watched her with new awareness. The slight flush in her cheeks, the way she avoided his eyes, the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne. Small details that separately meant nothing, but together painted a damning picture. How was your lunch? He asked casually. Fine. Boring office talk, Tanya replied, busying herself with unloading groceries. I stopped for a few things on the way home. Caleb nodded, noting another lie to add to his mental tally. I'm taking Brady fishing this weekend. Just the 2 of us. That sounds nice, she said distantly, already checking her phone. That night, as Tanya slept beside him, Caleb stared at the ceiling, his mind calculating his next moves. In Afghanistan, he had learned patience. The hasty often became the dead. Whatever was happening with Tanya, he would approach it like any mission, gather intelligence, assess the situation, and then, only then, decide how to respond. Chapter 2. Gathering Intel. The security system in the Wolf home had been Caleb's design, comprehensive but discreet. Most of the equipment was visible: door sensors, motion detectors, cameras at entry points. What Tanya didn't know was that Caleb had installed additional surveillance as a precaution, given his occasional high-profile security clients. It took him less than an hour to activate the dormant system while Tanya was at work. Small, virtually undetectable cameras and microphones in common areas of the house would feed directly to a secure server Caleb could access remotely. He felt a pang of guilt at spying on his own home, but pushed it aside. He needed facts. For 3 days, Caleb maintained his normal routine while monitoring the feeds during his work hours. Nothing unusual happened until Thursday afternoon. Tanya arrived home at 2:30, 2 hours before her usual time. 30 minutes later, a dark SUV pulled up. The man who entered their home was tall and well-dressed, with the confident bearing of someone used to getting what he wanted. Russell Mercer, according to his vehicle registration, which Caleb had already traced. 45 years old, divorced, owner of Mercer Development, a company that had been buying up commercial properties throughout the county. Caleb watched impassively as Russell embraced Tanya in their living room, their kiss removing any doubt about the nature of their relationship. The conversation that followed revealed they'd been seeing each other for nearly 7 months. 7 months of lies. When are you going to tell him? Russell asked, pouring himself a drink from Caleb's whiskey collection. It's complicated, Tanya replied. He's Brady's father, and you know his background. He was in special forces. Those men are intense. Russell laughed dismissively. He's a security consultant now. Teaches rich executives how to avoid getting kidnapped. Not exactly Delta Force anymore. You don't understand, Tanya insisted. Caleb isn't like normal men. He notices things others don't. He thinks differently. If he's so observant, why hasn't he figured us out yet? Russell pulled her closer. Maybe he's not as sharp as he used to be. Caleb watched them move upstairs to the bedroom he shared with Tanya, but he didn't follow the feed. He'd seen enough. The laptop closed with a decisive click as he leaned back in his office chair, his face betraying no emotion while his mind cataloged every detail of what he'd witnessed. Later that evening, Caleb sat across from Tanya at dinner, studying her with new eyes. The woman who'd once been his partner in all things was now a stranger wearing his wife's face. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice casual as he passed Brady the potatoes. "Busy," Tanya replied, not meeting his gaze. "Showed properties all afternoon." Another lie to add to the collection. Caleb nodded, as if he believed her. After dinner, he retreated to his home office, ostensibly to work, but actually to conduct deeper research on Russell Mercer. What he found was illuminating. Mercer Development had a reputation for aggressive business tactics. Several smaller property owners had claimed they were pressured or threatened into selling. No charges had ever stuck, but the pattern was clear. More interesting were Russell's associates, particularly 4 men who served as his informal enforcement team. Former criminals who'd found legitimate employment with Mercer while still engaging in questionable activities on his behalf. Men like Perry Dowd, a former enforcer for a loan shark, now Mercer's head of security, and Vince Mueller, who'd done time for aggravated assault before becoming Mercer's property acquisition specialist. Caleb committed their faces to memory, a habit from his days of studying target packages before missions. He wasn't planning anything, not yet, but information was always valuable. The next day, rather than confronting Tanya, Caleb decided to expand his intelligence gathering. He placed a tracker on her car and set up surveillance on Russell Mercer's lakeside home. The property was impressive for bedrooms, private dock, expansive grounds, all surrounded by a security system that Caleb found laughably inadequate. Over the next week, a pattern emerged. Tanya would meet Russell either at his home or at a small apartment he kept in town. Twice, they met with a real estate attorney. Once, they had dinner with a couple Caleb recognized as the Harrimans, owners of the largest undeveloped lakefront property in the county, property that adjoined Caleb and Tanya's land. On the personal front, Caleb maintained his composure, playing the role of unsuspecting husband while gathering more information. He took Brady fishing as planned, using the time to subtly assess how much his son suspected. "Mom's been different lately," Brady observed as they sat in the boat, lines cast into the still water. How so? Caleb asked, keeping his tone conversational. Brady shrugged. Distant. Always on her phone. And she's been asking weird questions about our property, like what we would do if we moved. This was new information. Caleb filed it away. People go through phases, Brady. Don't worry too much. Are you guys getting divorced? The question was blunt, typical of Brady's straightforward nature. Caleb looked at his son, seeing worry beneath the teenager's attempted nonchalance. I don't know what's going to happen, he answered honestly. But whatever does, you and I will be okay. That's a promise. Brady nodded, seeming satisfied with his father's candor. They spent the rest of the day discussing Brady's plans for college and his interest in marine biology, deliberately avoiding the subject of Tanya. By the end of the second week of surveillance, Caleb had compiled a comprehensive picture. Tanya was not only having an affair with Russell Mercer, but appeared to be involved in his business dealings. Specifically, she was helping him identify vulnerable properties for acquisition, using her position at the real estate firm to access non-public information. Most concerning was a conversation Caleb captured between Russell and his associate Perry Dowd, discussing the Wolf property. His wife says he'll never sell willingly, Perry reported. Too attached to the land. But she's working on getting her name added to the deed. Once that happens, she could sell her half, force a partition. Russell had laughed. By then, she'll be his ex-wife. And if he becomes difficult, well, you know how to handle difficult people. The threat was clear, and it ignited something cold and focused in Caleb. He'd faced death many times during his military career. He'd looked into the eyes of men who wanted to kill him and walked away while they didn't. Russell Mercer and his associates weren't the first to underestimate him, but Caleb would ensure they learned their lesson thoroughly. That night, as he watched Tanya prepare for bed, going through the motions of their marriage, Caleb made his decision. He would not confront her. Not yet. The situation was larger than just her infidelity. If Russell Mercer and his people were willing to threaten Caleb over property, they were a danger to Brady as well. And there was nothing in this world that Caleb protected more fiercely than his son. Chapter 3. The Catalyst. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Caleb was reviewing security protocols for a new client when his phone vibrated. The school nurse's number flashed on the screen, sending a spike of adrenaline through his system. Mr. Wolf? This is Nurse Alvarez from River Point High. Brady's had an accident. He's being transported to Memorial Hospital right now. The world narrowed to a tunnel of focused clarity. What happened? He fell down a flight of stairs. He has a broken arm, possibly a concussion. He was conscious when the ambulance arrived. I'm on my way. Caleb ended the call, grabbed his keys, and was in his truck within seconds. The 20-minute drive to the hospital took 12 minutes. Caleb parked haphazardly near the emergency entrance and strode in, his presence commanding enough that the receptionist immediately directed him to Brady's location. He found his son in a curtained-off section of the ER, his left arm in a temporary cast, a bruise darkening his right cheekbone. The sight of his injured child triggered something primal in Caleb, a protective rage he carefully controlled. Brady, he said softly, moving to his son's side. What happened? Brady's eyes, glassy from pain medication, focused on his father. Dad, he said, his voice slightly slurred. I came home for lunch. I forgot my biology textbook. Caleb frowned. Their house was a 15-minute walk from the school. Brady occasionally went home during lunch, but rarely without texting first. Mom's boyfriend was there, Brady continued, the words sending a chill through Caleb. With his friends. 4 of them. Russell, Caleb clarified, keeping his voice steady despite the fury building inside him. Brady nodded. I didn't know who they were at first. They were in the living room with Mom, looking at maps of our property. When I asked who they were, they laughed. He paused, grimacing as he shifted position. The big guy, not Russell, one of the others, said I should learn to knock. I told him it was my house. He called me a smartass and shoved me. I was near the top of the stairs and lost my balance. He pushed you down the stairs? Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. Mom tried to stop it, Brady added quickly. She yelled at him, but after I fell, Russell told her to take care of me while they finished their business. She drove me to school, said the nurse could check me out. but I felt really dizzy, so they called an ambulance. Where's your mother now? She said she had to go back home to talk to Russell. Brady's eyes welled with tears. Dad, they're still at our house with Mom. I don't think she wants them there, but she seemed scared. A cold, calculating focus settled over Caleb, a state of mind his former teammates had called the wolf hunt. In combat situations, while others grew jittery or aggressive, Caleb became preternaturally calm, his thinking crystal clear, movements precise and economical. You're safe now, he assured Brady, squeezing his good hand. I'm going to talk to your doctor, then I'll take care of everything. The ER doctor confirmed Brady had a clean break of the radius, a mild concussion, and extensive bruising. He wanted to keep him overnight for observation due to the head injury. I'll be back soon, Caleb told Brady after the doctor left. You rest. Don't worry about anything. In a hospital parking lot, Caleb sat in his truck for exactly 2 minutes, formulating his approach. The old Caleb, the civilian who played by society's rules, would call the police, file a report, press charges. But that Caleb had been steadily eroding as he uncovered the extent of Tanya's betrayal, and now he was gone entirely. In his place was the man who had operated behind enemy lines, who had eliminated threats with surgical precision, who had lived by a different code, one where justice wasn't delegated but delivered personally. Caleb drove home with methodical calm. Observing that both Tanya's car and a black SUV he recognized as Russell's were in the driveway. 2 additional vehicles, a silver Audi and a red pickup, were parked on the street. For men, just as Brady had said, rather than pulling into the driveway, Caleb parked a block away and approached his property from the rear, moving through the wooded area with the silence his special forces training had instilled. From the cover of trees, he observed the house, noting positions of vehicles and cataloging potential entry points. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the living room offered a clear view inside. Tanya sat on the couch, her body language tense. Russell stood by the fireplace, drink in hand. 3 other men, whom Caleb identified as Perry Dowd, Vince Mueller, and a 3rd associate named Ray Cantrell, were scattered around the room. The 4th man, likely the one who'd pushed Brady, wasn't visible from this angle. Caleb circled to his workshop, a separate building behind the main house where he kept tools and equipment. Inside, he unlocked a hidden compartment in the workbench and removed a tactical vest, a combat knife, and his Glock 19 with suppressor, equipment he'd maintained but hoped never to use again. As he prepared, Caleb's mind was utterly clear. These men had entered his home. They had hurt his son. One way or another, they would pay for that transgression. Moving to the house, Caleb accessed a concealed entrance he'd built during renovations, a precaution born of paranoia that now proved prescient. The small door led to a utility space adjoining the kitchen, allowing him to enter undetected. From inside, he could hear the conversation clearly. Your kid's fine, a gruff voice was saying, likely Perry Dowd. Stop making such a big deal out of it. Kids bounce. He's in the hospital with a broken arm. Tanya responded, her voice tight. This has gone too far, Russell. I want them out of my house. Our future house, you mean, Russell replied smoothly. Once the deal goes through, this place is getting bulldozed anyway. Part of the marina expansion. I never agreed to that, Tanya protested. I told you I just want to sell my half and move to the city. A new voice, deeper than the others, spoke next. Lady, you're in too deep to start growing conscience. You signed those preliminary papers. Your husband's land is as good as ours. That's not legally binding without Caleb's signature, Tanya argued. And after what happened to Brady, he'll never. Let me worry about your husband, Russell interrupted. Travis here knows how to be persuasive. A 4th voice, Travis, presumably the man who'd pushed Brady, laughed. Military types are all the same. Act tough until you apply the right pressure, usually through the family. Caleb had heard enough. These men weren't just business associates using aggressive tactics. They were criminals who had threatened his family and injured his son. In his former life, Caleb had eliminated threats exactly like them. Men who hurt the innocent and believed themselves untouchable. He moved silently through the house, positioning himself in the hallway that connected to the living room. From there, He could see all 5 occupants clearly. Tanya on the couch, Russell by the fireplace, Perry and Vince standing near the windows, and Travis, a hulking man with a shaved head and tattoos visible beneath his shirt sleeves, lounging in Caleb's favorite chair. The sight of the man who had hurt Brady sitting there, smirking in the home Caleb had built, crystallized his resolve. These men had made a fatal error in judgment. They had assumed that because Caleb had left his military life behind, he was no longer dangerous. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Caleb stepped into the living room, his movements so sudden and silent that it took several seconds for anyone to notice his presence. Tanya saw him first, her eyes widening in shock. "Caleb," she gasped. "What are you?" "Brady's in hospital with a broken arm and a concussion," he said, his voice eerily calm. "He told me everything." Russell recovered quickly, adopting a conciliatory tone. "Look, Caleb, there was an unfortunate accident. Travis here got a little overzealous, but no real harm." "No real harm," Caleb repeated, his gaze shifting to Travis, who had risen from the chair and was eyeing Caleb with the misplaced confidence of a man who relied on his size for intimidation. "My son is in the hospital. Your wife invited us here," Travis said with a smirk. "Maybe you should control your woman better." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes caused Travis's smirk to falter. "I want all of you out of my house," Caleb stated calmly. "Now." Perry Dowd stepped forward, hand moving toward his jacket. "That's not how this is going to work, Wolf. We have business with your wife, and you're interrupting." What happened next occurred so quickly that later, Tanya would have difficulty describing it coherently. Caleb moved toward Perry with a speed that seemed impossible, deflecting his attempt to draw a weapon and driving a precise strike to his throat. Perry collapsed, gasping for air through a crushed windpipe. Vince and Travis responded immediately, both reaching for weapons. Caleb's Glock appeared in his hand, as if by magic, 2 suppressed shots finding their targets before either man could clear their holsters. Vince fell with a bullet in his chest. Travis took a round to the thigh and stumbled, cursing. Russell had backed against the fireplace, his face a mask of shock. "What the fuck? You're insane." Caleb ignored him, addressing Tanya instead. "Get out." "Caleb, please," she began, her voice trembling. "I can explain." "Get out." He didn't raise his voice, but the command in his tone was unmistakable. "Go to the hospital. Stay with our son." Tanya hesitated only briefly before grabbing her purse and fleeing the house, leaving Russell and his remaining associates to face Caleb alone. As the door closed behind her, Caleb surveyed the room with cold detachment. Perry on the floor, struggling for breath he wouldn't find. Vince motionless, blood pooling beneath him. Travis clutching his wounded leg, fear replacing bravado in his eyes. And Russell Mercer, the man who had seduced Caleb's wife, plotted to steal his land, and brought men into his home who had hurt his son. Russell, who was now realizing the magnitude of his miscalculation. "You can't do this," Russell said, his confident demeanor crumbling. "You can't just kill people. There are laws. For men enter my home today," Caleb stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "For men who injure my son and threaten my family." He moved toward Russell with the measured pace of a predator who knows its prey can't escape. None of them are leaving alive. Chapter 4. Cleaning House. The aftermath required precision and focus. Caleb worked methodically, his movements economical, his mind clear. In his former life, he had sometimes been tasked with ensuring operations left no trace. Those skills, dormant for years, returned with practiced ease. Travis had been the last to die, begging for his life even as Caleb questioned him about Russell's operation, extracting valuable intelligence about properties, partners, and plans. The man had been pathetically eager to betray his employer in a futile attempt to save himself. By nightfall, all evidence that Russell Mercer and his associates had ever visited the Wolf residence had been eliminated. Their vehicles were gone, relocated to a long-term parking facility at the regional airport. Their phones had been disposed of separately, batteries removed. And the men themselves? The abandoned iron mine outside of town had shafts that descended hundreds of feet into darkness. It had claimed the lives of 19 minors in its operational history. Now it claimed 4 more. Caleb returned home and meticulously cleaned the house, removing all traces of blood and gunpowder residue. The security footage from his hidden system was downloaded to an encrypted drive and the originals erased. By midnight, the house was immaculate, showing no signs of the violence that had occurred hours earlier. Only then did he shower, change, and drive to the hospital. He found Tanya in the waiting room outside Brady's room, her face pale, eyes red from crying. "The doctor says he's sleeping," she said as Caleb approached. "They gave him something for the pain." Caleb nodded, regarding his wife with detached interest. The woman he had loved for 18 years now seemed like a stranger, or perhaps he was finally seeing what had always been there beneath the surface. "What happened to them?" Tanya asked quietly, glancing around to ensure no one could overhear. "You don't want to know?" Caleb replied. "And if anyone asks, you left them at the house with me and don't know where they went. They're dead, aren't they?" It wasn't really a question. Caleb didn't respond, which was answer enough. Tanya covered her mouth, stifling a sob. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of it. Russell said it was just business, that no one would get hurt. Brady got hurt. That was an accident. Travis has always been a hothead, but Russell never wanted. "Stop talking," Caleb interrupted, his voice low. "I don't care what Russell wanted. I don't care what you wanted. All that matters now is Brady." Tanya fell silent, her gaze dropping to the floor. After a moment, she asked, "What happens now?" "Now we act like a concerned mother and father whose son had an accident at school," Caleb said evenly. "Nothing else happened today. Russell and his associates are just people you've met through work. If they don't show up for a while, that's not unusual or concerning. And us." Tanya's voice was barely audible. "What about us, Caleb?" Caleb studied her, seeing not the young woman he'd married, but someone corrupted by greed and selfishness. Someone who had been willing to betray not just him, but their son. "There is no us anymore," he stated simply. "But for Brady's sake, we'll maintain appearances until he's recovered. Then we'll divorce quietly. You'll get a fair settlement, enough to start over somewhere else. Somewhere far from here. You're just discarding me?" Anger flashed through her fear. "After 18 years, you discarded us when you started sleeping with Russell," Caleb replied without heat. "When you plotted to take my land. When you brought men into our home who hurt our son." Before she could respond, a nurse approached to tell them Brady was awake and asking for his parents. The conversation ended there, but the message was clear. Tanya had made her choice, and now Caleb had made his. In Brady's hospital room, Caleb settled into the chair beside the bed while Tanya nervously hovered near the door. "Hey, kiddo," Caleb said gently. "How's the arm?" "Hurts," Brady admitted, "but the drugs are pretty good." His gaze shifted between his parents, sensing the tension. "What happened? Did you go home, Dad?" "I did," Caleb confirmed. "Had a talk with Mr. Mercer and his friends. They won't be bothering us again." Brady's eyes widened slightly. "What did you do?" "Just talked," Caleb assured him, though something in his expression made Brady study him more closely. Some men only understand certain kinds of conversations. Tanya interjected, her voice artificially bright. "The important thing is that you're okay, Brady. The doctor says you can probably go home tomorrow." Brady nodded, still watching his father. At 16, he wasn't naive. He had grown up hearing stories about his father's military service. Carefully sanitized versions, but enough to know Caleb Wolf wasn't a man to be crossed. "Get some rest," Caleb told him, squeezing his good hand. "I'll be right here all night." After Brady drifted back to sleep, Tanya whispered that she was going home to change clothes. Caleb acknowledged this with a nod, not bothering to look at her. As far as he was concerned, their marriage had ended the moment he'd watched her with Russell through the security feed. Alone with his sleeping son, Caleb allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had killed before, during his military service. Those deaths had been sanctioned by his country, part of operations targeting enemy combatants. Today had been different, a personal choice to eliminate men who threatened his family. He searched himself for remorse or doubt and found none. These men had entered his home, injured his son, and made it clear they intended further harm. In the natural world, Such actions against a predator's offspring typically resulted in only one outcome. Humans had created laws and social constraints that suppressed these natural responses, but beneath the veneer of civilization, certain truths remained. Don't threaten what a man holds dear unless you're prepared for the consequences. The next day, Brady was discharged with instructions for follow-up care. During the drive home, Caleb outlined a modified version of what had happened. Mr. Mercer and his associates won't be coming around anymore, he explained. Your mother and I had a long talk with them. They understood that their business proposals weren't welcome. Is that why Mom's been crying? Brady asked perceptively. Caleb glanced at his son. Your mother and I have been having problems for a while. You've noticed that. What happened yesterday brought things to a head. We'll be separating soon. Brady absorbed this information in silence, then asked, Is it because she was seeing that Russell guy? You knew. Brady shrugged his good shoulder. I'm not a little kid, Dad. I've seen how she acts, always on her phone, making excuses to leave. And that day I came home and found him there. It was pretty obvious. Caleb nodded, impressed yet again by his son's perceptiveness. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. It's not your fault, Brady said firmly. Mom made her choices. She's still your mother, Caleb reminded him. Whatever happens between us doesn't change that. Brady looked out the window. Will I stay with you? After the divorce. If that's what you want. It is. The simple declaration warmed something in Caleb's chest, a reminder of why he had done what he did. Not just to punish those who had harmed his son, but to protect Brady's future. The following days established a new normal. Tanya moved into the guest room, maintaining the facade of a concerned wife and mother, while privately making arrangements for her departure. Caleb assisted Brady with homework and daily activities limited by his caste, all while monitoring news reports and police bulletins for any mention of Russell Mercer or his associates. As expected, their disappearance was noted, first by business associates, then by authorities. Russell had been a prominent figure in local development. After all, his sudden absence, along with that of his key employees, raised questions. Caleb observed the investigation with clinical detachment. The men's vehicles being found at the airport created an initial theory that they had left town, possibly due to financial troubles or legal issues that subsequent investigation began to uncover. Russell's business dealings, it seemed, had involved numerous illegalities that were now coming to light in his absence. The consensus among law enforcement was that Russell and his associates had fled to avoid prosecution. International credit card activity, carefully orchestrated by Caleb using information extracted from Travis, supported this theory, creating a trail that led to Mexico and then overseas. While this investigation progressed, Caleb focused on the next phase of his plan. He had eliminated the immediate threat, but there were loose ends to tie up, particularly regarding Russell's business partners and the shadowy investors behind his development projects. Travis's final confessions had revealed an operation larger than just Russell's ambitions. There were powerful interests involved, people who had funded Russell's property acquisitions with the goal of developing the entire lakefront into a resort complex. People who might notice Russell's disappearance and send others to continue his work. People who might still pose a threat to Caleb and Brady. Caleb had no intention of waiting to find out. In warfare, the successful strategist seized the initiative rather than reacting to enemy movements. He would identify these hidden players and neutralize the threat they posed permanently. The hunter was on the move, and his prey had no idea they were being stalked. Chapter 5. Following the Money. The offices of Mercer Development occupied the entire fifth floor of River Point's only high-rise building. The space featured contemporary design, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a reception area meant to impress potential investors. At 2:17 a.m., however, the only illumination came from the dim emergency lighting and the small flashlight Caleb used to navigate his way to Russell's private office. Security had been minimal. A standard alarm system Caleb had disabled in under 3 minutes, and a night guard who patrolled the building's perimeter once an hour with clockwork predictability. The lock on Russell's office door took slightly longer, its biometric component requiring specialized equipment Caleb had acquired from contacts in his security consulting business. Once inside, Caleb moved efficiently. The computer would be monitored and possibly remotely accessed by whatever organization had backed Russell's operations. Instead, Caleb focused on a small safe concealed behind an original Wyeth landscape, the combination for which he had extracted from Travis during their brief but productive interrogation. Inside the safe, Caleb found what he sought: an external hard drive, a ledger with handwritten notes, and a series of documents outlining the true ownership structure of Mercer Development. These items went into his bag, along with selected files from Russell's desk that Travis had identified as important. As he prepared to leave, Caleb noticed a framed photograph on Russell's desk. Russell standing beside a distinguished-looking older man on a golf course, both smiling confidently at the camera. Caleb recognized the older man immediately: Charles Beaumont, the region's wealthiest resident and a major political donor whose name adorned hospital wings and university buildings. According to the information from Travis, Beaumont was more than just a prominent citizen. He was the primary investor behind the Lakefront Development Project, with connections to state officials who had expedited permits and rezoning applications. Russell had been his frontman, the public face who handled the messy details while Beaumont remained at a clean distance. Caleb pocketed the photograph and exited the office, leaving no trace of his presence. His next stop was Russell's apartment in town, the one he had used for meetings with Tanya and others he wanted to keep separate from his public life. The apartment yielded additional intelligence: a laptop not connected to Mercer Development systems, financial records for offshore accounts, and a burner phone with contact numbers for individuals not in Russell's public address book. Most valuable was a calendar detailing upcoming meetings, including one scheduled for 3 days later at Beaumont's estate with representatives from a foreign investment group. By dawn, Caleb had compiled enough information to understand the full scope of the operation that had targeted his land. The lakefront development was merely the public-facing portion of a larger scheme involving water rights acquisition, mineral leases, and infrastructure contracts worth hundreds of millions. The project had attracted investment from a consortium with ties to organized crime, using shell companies and local proxies like Russell to maintain deniability. The technical term for such operations, Caleb knew, was strategic corruption, the systematic compromise of local governance and regulatory frameworks to enable large-scale extraction of resources and profits. He had seen similar patterns in developing nations during his military career, usually involving warlords and multinational corporations. The principles remained the same even in small-town America. Identify valuable resources, corrupt or control local officials, and extract maximum profit while externalizing costs to the community. Caleb's property, with its extensive lakefront access and unique position at the center of the planned development, had been a key acquisition target. Without it, the project's viability was significantly reduced, which explained why Russell and his backers had been willing to resort to threats and intimidation. The question now was how to proceed. The organization behind Russell was larger and more sophisticated than a few local thugs. Charles Beaumont had political connections, private security, and the resources to cause significant problems for anyone who opposed him. A direct confrontation would be unwise. In the military, Caleb had learned that asymmetric warfare required identifying critical vulnerabilities rather than attacking strength directly. He needed to find Beaumont's weak points, the exposure he couldn't afford, the pressure points that would force him to abandon the project. The answer began to emerge as Caleb reviewed the financial documents from Russell's laptop. The development project relied on a complex structure of loans, investments, and advance payments that created significant leverage. Beaumont had overextended himself, betting heavily on the project's success to offset mounting gambling debts and investment losses elsewhere. More importantly, the foreign investors were not people who tolerated failure or excuses. Their latest capital injection came with specific performance requirements and deadlines. Russell's sudden disappearance had already created complications. Any further delays or obstacles would trigger clauses that could be financially devastating for Beaumont. Caleb allowed himself a small, cold smile. He had found the vulnerability. That afternoon, while Tanya took Brady to a follow-up medical appointment, Caleb used Russell's burner phone to send messages to key contacts, including Charles Beaumont. The messages, seemingly from Russell, cited unforeseen complications and postponed the upcoming meeting with the foreign investors. Additional messages to financial partners requested patience regarding certain payments and commitments. The response was immediate and revealing. Beaumont called the burner phone repeatedly, leaving increasingly agitated voicemails demanding Russell contact him immediately. Other partners sent terse messages expressing concern and, in some cases, barely veiled threats. Caleb observed this reaction with clinical interest. He had created uncertainty, and uncertainty was often more destabilizing than direct opposition. Now, he needed to apply additional pressure at strategic points. The next morning, anonymized information about the development project's environmental impact, conveniently detailed in Russell's files, was delivered to both the State Environmental Protection Agency and a prominent environmental advocacy group. By afternoon, preliminary inquiries were underway, and local news outlets had begun reporting on potential wetlands violations associated with the proposed development. Simultaneously, Caleb used his legitimate security consulting business to approach the Foreign Investment Group's regional representative, offering specialized due diligence services for their American investments. The representative, impressed by Caleb's credentials and military background, agreed to meet. The meeting took place at an upscale restaurant in the nearest city. Caleb presented himself as a concerned professional who had noticed irregularities in the lakefront development project while conducting research for another client. I believe your investors may not have received complete information regarding certain regulatory and financial aspects of the project, Caleb explained, sliding a folder across the table. These documents suggest significant undisclosed liabilities. The representative, a sharp-eyed woman named Helena Vasquez, reviewed the materials with practiced efficiency. These are internal documents, she noted. May I ask how you obtained them? I have sources, Caleb replied simply. The important question is whether your principals would prefer to learn about these issues now, from a discreet third party, or later, when regulatory agencies and journalists are involved. Helena studied him carefully. What is your interest in this matter, Mr. Wolf? Are you seeking compensation for this information? I'm seeking the termination of the project, Caleb stated bluntly. My property adjoins the proposed development site. My family has been threatened by individuals associated with the project. My son was injured as a result. I see. Helena's expression revealed nothing. And you believe approaching us directly is the most effective strategy? I believe your organization values efficiency and dislikes unnecessary complications, Caleb replied. Continuing to back this project will create significant complications. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Helena finally nodded. I will convey your concerns to my principals. They will make their own determination. Of course, Caleb agreed. I should mention that similar information has been provided to other interested parties as a contingency measure. Any aggressive response would trigger wider disclosure. This time, Helena smiled thinly. You have military experience, I understand. I do. It shows. She closed the folder and stood. Expect a response within 48 hours. True to her word, the response came, not directly to Caleb, but through observable actions. Within 2 days, the Foreign Investment Group announced it was withdrawing from several American development projects, citing reassessment of market conditions. Charles Beaumont's name appeared in financial news stories discussing the impact of this withdrawal on regional development plans. More telling was the private security detail that suddenly appeared around Beaumont's estate. Not his usual personnel, but professional operatives with the bearing of men with serious training. Beaumont was scared, increasing his protection while simultaneously trying to salvage his financial position. Caleb monitored these developments while maintaining his normal routine, working with clients, helping Brady with his recovery, and coexisting with Tanya in their increasingly silent home. She had secured an apartment in the city and was preparing to move once Brady's arm had healed enough for him to be more independent. The pressure on Beaumont continued to build. Environmental regulators had placed a temporary hold on all development activity pending their investigation. Local news coverage had expanded to include questions about how certain permits had been approved despite clear regulatory conflicts. And the foreign investors' withdrawal had triggered loan covenants that required immediate repayment of significant sums. Caleb knew that corner predators were the most dangerous. Beaumont would be looking for ways to salvage the situation, potentially including identifying and eliminating the source of his troubles. The increased security around his estate suggested he anticipated retaliation, possibly from the foreign investors, but perhaps also from whoever had exposed his operations. This suited Caleb perfectly. Let Beaumont huddle behind his guards, jumping at shadows. The psychological pressure of waiting for an attack that might come from any direction at any time was its own form of punishment, one Caleb had employed against enemy commanders in his former life. But psychological pressure was just the beginning. Caleb had no intention of allowing Beaumont to recover, regroup, and potentially pose a future threat. The man had authorized actions that led to Brady's injury. That debt would be paid in full. The opportunity presented itself sooner than expected. Among Russell's contacts was a woman named Sophia Green, whose text messages suggested a personal relationship with Beaumont, despite her official role as his executive assistant. According to the messages, Beaumont's wife was away visiting family on the East Coast, and Sophia was staying at the estate, specifically in the guest house by the pool, away from the main residence where the security detail was concentrated. Caleb formulated his approach carefully. Direct infiltration of the estate would be challenging given the increased security. Instead, he would use Sophia as his entry point, not physically but informationally. A background check revealed that Sophia had a younger brother with a history of drug-related offenses currently on probation, a weakness Caleb could exploit without hesitation. The following evening, Sophia received an anonymous text with photographs, her brother meeting with a known drug dealer, clearly violating his probation terms. The accompanying message was simple: pool house, midnight, come alone or these go to his probation officer. At 11:58 p.m., security cameras showed Sophia leaving the main house and walking nervously toward the pool house, checking her phone repeatedly. At midnight exactly, she received another text. Inside the pool house. Door unlocked. Sophia hesitated visibly before entering the darkened building. Once inside, she found not a person but a laptop open on the table, its screen showing a video call interface. When she approached, the call connected automatically. Ms. Green, Caleb said, his face visible only in partial shadow. Thank you for joining me. Who are you? She demanded, fear and anger mingling in her voice. What do you want? Information, Caleb replied calmly, about Charles Beaumont and his connection to Russell Mercer. Sophia glanced nervously toward the door. I can't talk about that. Charles has security everywhere since Russell disappeared. Since Russell disappeared, Caleb repeated, an interesting choice of words. Not since Russell left, or since Russell went to Mexico. You believe something happened to him. I don't know anything about that, she insisted, but her expression betrayed uncertainty. I think you know more than you're admitting, Caleb countered. About Russell, about the development project, about the foreign investors. About what happened to my son. Sophia's eyes widened slightly. Your son, Brady Wolfe, 16 years old, pushed down a flight of stairs by one of Russell's associates in my home. My home that your boss wanted to acquire for his development. Understanding dawned on Sophia's face. You're Caleb Wolfe, the property owner Russell couldn't buy out. The one whose wife he was sleeping with, Caleb added dispassionately. The one whose son was injured. The one who wants to ensure Charles Beaumont understands the consequences of those actions. Sophia swallowed hard. What do you want from me? As I said, information. In exchange, your brother's indiscretions remain private. For the next 30 minutes, Sophia provided details far more valuable than anything in Russell's files. Beaumont's private schedule, the rotation pattern of his security detail, the layout of his estate, including entry points and blind spots in the surveillance system. Most importantly, his secure room, a reinforced space where he retreated when feeling particularly vulnerable. He's been sleeping there since Russell disappeared, Sophia revealed. He has a panic button that alerts a private security firm with a response time under 5 minutes. Caleb absorbed this information, constructing and discarding tactical approaches in his mind. One last question, Ms. Green. Does Beaumont deserve what's coming to him? Sophia hesitated, conflict evident in her expression. Then something hardened in her eyes. He told Russell to make an example of anyone who wouldn't sell. Set a target to family, if necessary. Well, I heard about that boy getting hurt. I almost quit. But you didn't, Caleb observed. No, she admitted quietly. I didn't. Thank you for your honesty. Caleb reached to end the call, then paused. The photos of your brother have been deleted. Make better choices than your employer, Ms. Green. The screen went dark, leaving Sophia alone in the pool house with the knowledge that Charles Beaumont's days were numbered. Chapter 6. Smoke and Mirrors. Charles Beaumont prided himself on being a man who controlled his environment. His estate, set on 20 acres of prime lakefront property, had been designed to project both power and security, a modern fortress disguised as a luxury residence. The events of the past week, however, had transformed this sanctuary into a prison of anxiety. Russell's disappearance had been concerning but manageable. The subsequent withdrawal of the foreign investors had been a significant setback. The regulatory investigation was a growing problem. But the most disturbing development was the sense that someone was methodically dismantling everything he had built, moving with precision and purpose toward an unstated but ominous goal. Beaumont's security team had doubled, then tripled. His daily schedule had been restricted to essential movements only. His communications were routed through secure channels. Yet none of these precautions had alleviated the crawling sensation between his shoulder blades, the feeling of being watched, studied, and measured for retribution. On the 7th day after Russell's disappearance, Beaumont received a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Russell Mercer standing beside him on the golf course, with 4 faces circled in red: Russell, Perry, Vince, and Travis. Across the bottom, written in black marker, were 6 words: "From men entered. None left alive." The implication was unambiguous. Beaumont immediately summoned his head of security, a former military contractor named Decker, and showed him the photograph. "Find out who sent this," Beaumont demanded, his voice tightly controlled despite his internal panic. "And increase security. No one enters the property without full identification and verification." Decker studied the photograph, his expression grim. "This looks like a death notification, sir. And a threat." "I'm aware of what it is," Beaumont snapped. "What I want to know is who sent it and what they want." "The phrasing suggests military," Decker observed. "The clarity of purpose, the directness. No demands, just a statement of fact and an implied warning." Beaumont paced the secure room where he now spent most of his time. "This has to be connected to the Wolf property. Russell said there was a problem with the owner, but assured me it was being handled." "What kind of problem?" "The man refused to sell. Russell was working on his wife instead. Apparently, she was amenable to the right incentives." Beaumont waved dismissively. The details weren't important as long as Russell delivered results. Decker's expression suggested he found this approach short-sighted. "Do you have information on this property owner? Background, employment, potential capabilities?" Beaumont retrieved his tablet and pulled up a file. "Caleb Wolf, 42, owns a security consulting business. Prior to that, military service, Army, I believe." "What kind of military service?" Decker asked, his interest visibly sharpening. "Does it matter?" "He teaches corporate executives how to avoid kidnapping." "Hardly relevant to our situation." Decker took the tablet and scrolled through the file. His expression changed as he read further. "Sir, this isn't just military service. Caleb Wolf was Delta Force, Tier 1 Special Operations, deployed to Afghanistan and other locations classified, even in this background check. Multiple commendations, details redacted." Beaumont dismissed this with a wave. "That was years ago. He's a civilian now." "With all due respect, sir, men like that don't ever truly become civilians," Decker countered. "The training, the mindset, it stays with them. And if something happened to trigger a return to operational thinking? What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if Russell or his people did something to provoke this man, particularly involving his family, we may be dealing with a significantly more dangerous situation than you realize. Beaumont sank into his chair, the implications settling over him. You think Wolf eliminated Russell and his team? That's murder. Multiple murders. In his mind, it might be something else entirely, Decker said carefully. Special operations personnel are trained to identify and neutralize threats with extreme prejudice. If he perceived Russell's team as a threat to his family. So what do? We need more information, Decker decided. I'll have the team investigate any connection between Wolf and Russell's disappearance. In the meantime, we maintain maximum security protocols. What neither man knew was that their conversation was being monitored. The secure room had been compromised 3 days earlier when an apparent maintenance technician, actually an associate of Caleb's from his military days, had installed specialized surveillance equipment while updating the estate's security systems. Caleb listened to their discussion from a nondescript van parked at a scenic overlook a mile from Beaumont's estate. The mention of his military background brought a grim smile to his face. Decker was right about one thing. Certain training never fully reseeded, merely waiting beneath the surface for circumstances that required its application. The next phase of Caleb's plan involved creating distractions that would fragment Beaumont's attention and resources. The first came that evening, when an anonymous tip led police to search an abandoned warehouse owned by one of Beaumont's shell companies. They discovered evidence suggesting it had been used for illegal activities connected to the development project. Nothing conclusive enough for immediate arrests, but sufficient to warrant further investigation. The second distraction arrived the following morning. A detailed dossier on Beaumont's tax manipulations and regulatory violations was delivered to the regional office of the IRS. By afternoon, preliminary inquiries were underway, with notifications sent to Beaumont's legal team requesting extensive documentation. The third and most effective distraction targeted Beaumont's reputation directly. Carefully selected communications from Russell's files, authenticated and containing Beaumont's explicit instructions regarding coercive tactics against property owners, were provided to a journalist known for investigating corruption in real estate development. The resulting article, published online with promises of further revelations to come, created immediate ripples through Beaumont's social and business circles. Each of these actions forced Beaumont to divide his attention and resources, directing some of his security personnel to manage the growing threats to his freedom and fortune rather than focusing exclusively on his physical protection. More importantly, they increased his stress and sense of being besieged from all sides, psychological pressure that would inevitably lead to mistakes. While Beaumont scrambled to contain these various crises, Caleb prepared for direct action. The intelligence gathered from Sophia Green had provided a comprehensive understanding of the estate's security measures and vulnerabilities. The surveillance of Beaumont's secure room had yielded additional insights about his movements and habits. The most valuable information, however, came from an unexpected source. Decker, the security chief, had begun his own investigation into Caleb's background and activities. This included contacting former military personnel who had served with him, seeking insights into his capabilities and potential strategies. One of those contacts was Alex Reeves, who had indeed served with Caleb in Afghanistan, and who remained a trusted associate. Instead of providing accurate information about Caleb's likely approach, Alex fed Decker carefully crafted misinformation, suggesting that Caleb, if responsible for Russell's disappearance, would likely follow a specific tactical doctrine that emphasized direct confrontation after systematic isolation of the target. Armed with this intelligence, Decker repositioned his security assets to defend against the anticipated approach. In doing so, he inadvertently created openings in other areas, openings Caleb had identified and planned to exploit. The final element fell into place when Beaumont's wife announced she was extending her East Coast visit indefinitely, having read the news reports about her husband's alleged activities. This further destabilized Beaumont emotionally, making him more erratic and less methodical in his security protocols. 3 days later, at precisely 2:17 a.m., the dead zone in human alertness when night shift personnel were at their lowest functional capacity, Caleb initiated his approach to the estate. Rather than attempting to defeat the sophisticated perimeter security directly, he utilized the property's drainage system, a series of large pipes that channeled water from the higher portions of the estate to the lake. These drainage pipes, installed during the original construction and predating the current security systems, provided access to the grounds near the pool house. From there, Caleb moved through the property using blind spots in the surveillance coverage that Sophia had identified, his movements timed to coincide with the patrol patterns of the security team. Reaching the main house required neutralizing 2 guards, not fatally, but with sufficient efficiency to ensure they remained unconscious for the duration of his mission. Both men were disabled with precisely applied pressure to carotid arteries, restricting blood flow to the brain long enough to render them unconscious without permanent harm. Inside the house, Caleb navigated to the east wing where Beaumont's secure room was located. The room itself presented a significant challenge: reinforced walls, a hardened door with biometric locks, and direct connection to an emergency response system. According to Decker's security protocols, any attempt to breach the room would trigger an immediate armed response. Caleb had no intention of breaching the room. Instead, he accessed the environmental control system for that section of the house, a separate panel located in a utility closet nearby. From there, he was able to introduce a colorless, odorless gas into the ventilation system serving the secure room. The gas, a non-lethal incapacitating agent developed for hostage rescue scenarios, would render Beaumont unconscious within minutes of exposure. The room's air filtration system, designed to protect against conventional chemical threats, wasn't calibrated to detect or remove this particular compound. While waiting for the gas to take effect, Caleb disabled the direct line to the security company and looped the surveillance footage of the secure room, creating the appearance that Beaumont was sleeping normally. When sufficient time had elapsed, he bypassed the biometric locks using techniques developed for covert entry operations during his military service. Inside the secure room, he found Charles Beaumont unconscious on the bed, his breathing shallow but stable. Caleb efficiently secured him with restraints, covered his mouth with specialized tape that allowed breathing but prevented speech, and administered a mild sedative to ensure continued unconsciousness during transport. Exiting the estate proved simpler than entering. Beaumont, wrapped in a body bag similar to those used by high-end security teams for emergency evacuations, was carried by Caleb directly through the front entrance. The 2 guards stationed there, having received an apparent authorization code from Decker via their communication system, allowed the presumed security specialist to load the package into an unmarked vehicle identical to those used by Beaumont's security team. By dawn, Charles Beaumont found himself regaining consciousness in an unfamiliar location, a small, windowless room with concrete walls reminiscent of a cold storage facility. His hands were secured to the chair where he sat, and across from him, watching with detached interest, was Caleb Wolfe. "Mr. Beaumont," Caleb acknowledged as Beaumont's eyes focused. "Welcome back." Beaumont attempted to speak, found his mouth uncooperatively dry, and settled for glaring at his captor. "You're wondering what this is about," Caleb continued conversationally. "Why you here? What I want from you?" He leaned forward slightly. "It's quite simple, really. Your associate Russell Mercer seduced my wife. He brought men into my home who injure my son, all in service to your development project." Beaumont swallowed with difficulty. I never authorized." "You told Russell to make an example of anyone who wouldn't sell," Caleb interrupted. "You said to target the family if necessary." "Your words, Mr. Beaumont, recorded in Russell's meticulous notes." "That was just business talk," Beaumont protested weakly. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt." "My son has a broken arm and a concussion," Caleb stated, his voice remaining eerily calm. "He was pushed down a staircase in his own home by men you employed. Men you directed to pressure my family." Beaumont's eyes darted around the room, seeking some escape or advantage. Finding none, he attempted a different approach. What do you want? Money? I can pay whatever you're asking. I'm not interested in your money, Caleb replied. What I want is your complete withdrawal from the lakefront development project, the dissolution of all related business entities, your permanent departure from the region, and a very generous contribution to my son's college fund. That's millions in losses, Beaumont sputtered. Years of planning, investments. The alternative, Caleb interrupted smoothly, is less pleasant. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Beaumont studied Caleb's expression, searching for any sign of bluff or uncertainty. Finding none, he asked, "What happened to Russell and his men? What do you think happened?" Caleb countered. Beaumont swallowed hard. "You killed them." "For men enter my home," Caleb confirmed without emotion. "Men who threaten my family and injure my son. None of them left alive." The blunt admission seemed to drain what little resistance remained in Beaumont. "You'll never get away with this. Kidnapping, murder, you're talking about serious crimes." "I'm talking about consequences," Caleb corrected. "Something men like you and Russell believe you're immune to. You move through the world taking what you want, hurting whoever stands in your way, secure in the belief that your money and connections protect you from repercussions." He leaned closer. "But some lines shouldn't be crossed, Mr. Beaumont. Threatening a man's family is one of them. What's to stop me from going to the police as soon as you release me?" Beaumont challenged, a last flicker of defiance. Caleb smiled thinly. "Several things. First, the extensive evidence of your criminal activities that has already been provided to various authorities. Second, the additional evidence I've gathered about your personal indiscretions, which I'm certain your wife and business associates would find fascinating." He paused, allowing this to sink in. "And finally, the simple fact that if you choose that path, I will find you again. And our next conversation won't be nearly this civilized." Beaumont stared at him, seeming to truly see the man before him for the first time. Not just a property owner who refused to sell, but a trained operator with both the capability and willingness to eliminate threats permanently. "What guarantee do I have that you'll let me go if I agree?" he asked finally. "You have my word," Caleb replied, "which, unlike yours, actually means something." Hours later, a series of legal documents were delivered to Caleb's home by courier. They detailed the complete dissolution of the lakefront development project, Beaumont's divestment from all related business interests, and the establishment of a substantial educational trust for Brady Wolfe. Accompanying the papers was a brief note. "I'm relocating to Arizona, effective immediately. Our business is concluded." Charles Beaumont was released that evening at a rest stop 50 miles outside of town, disoriented but physically unharmed. By morning, he had indeed departed the region, leaving behind a collapsing business empire and a community full of unanswered questions about Russell Mercer's disappearance. For Caleb, these outcomes were secondary to the primary objective, ensuring his son's safety. With both Russell and Beaumont removed as threats, Brady could heal and continue his life without looking over his shoulder. The cost, in moral terms, in legal risk, in the coldly calculated elimination of threats, was one Caleb accepted without reservation. Some would call it vigilante justice. Caleb considered it the natural response of a predator protecting its offspring. The distinction was academic. What mattered was that those who had threatened his family now understood the fatal error of their calculation. Nobody touches his boy and walks away. Chapter 7. The Price of Blood. The dissolution of Beaumont's development project sent ripples through River Point. Property values stabilized after weeks of speculative fluctuation. Businesses that had positioned themselves to capitalize on the expected influx of tourists and wealthy second home owners adjusted their plans. Local officials who had expedited permits and rezoning applications suddenly found themselves subject to increased scrutiny from state regulatory agencies. Throughout these community-wide adjustments, Caleb maintained his normal routine. He met with clients, advised on security protocols, and spent evenings helping Brady with homework and rehabilitation exercises for his injured arm. To outward appearances, he was simply a concerned father focused on his son's recovery while navigating the end of his marriage. Internally, Caleb conducted a meticulous assessment of his actions and their potential consequences. He had eliminated 5 men, Russell and his associates directly, Beaumont as a threat though not physically. The bodies of the 4 men would likely never be found, having been secured in the abandoned mine shaft with careful attention to ensuring they remained undetectable. Beaumont had powerful incentives to maintain silence about his abduction and the events leading to his departure from the region. The potential weak links were Tanya and Sophia Green. Tanya knew some of what had occurred, but not the full extent of Caleb's actions. Her complicity in the aftermath, her silence about the men's visit to their home on the day of Brady's injury, made her an unlikely source of information for authorities. Additionally, her own involvement with Russell and the planned property scheme gave her strong motivation to avoid scrutiny. Sophia Green presented a different calculation. She had provided crucial information about Beaumont's security arrangements, but had no direct knowledge of what Caleb had done with that information. Her assistance had been motivated by her own moral qualms about Beaumont's business practices and the harm to Brady. Still, she represented a potential vulnerability in Caleb's operational security. Both women warranted monitoring, but not immediate action. Caleb established discreet surveillance on Sophia while maintaining careful observation of Tanya's activities within their increasingly separate lives. The more immediate concern was Brady. The boy was perceptive and had already connected certain dots regarding the disappearance of Russell and his associates. During a fishing trip 3 weeks after Beaumont's departure, Brady broached the subject directly. "Those men who were at our house," he began, carefully baiting his hook. "The ones who pushed me. They're not coming back, are they?" Caleb studied his son's profile, noting the seriousness in his expression. "No, they're not." Brady nodded, seeming to accept this answer at face value. After a moment, he asked, "Did you make them go away?" The question was deliberately ambiguous, offering Caleb the option to interpret it as he chose. He could provide a sanitized version that preserved Brady's innocence, or he could acknowledge the truth in a way that respected his son's intelligence. "Yes," Caleb replied simply. Brady cast his line into the lake, the lure arcing gracefully before dropping into the water with barely a splash. "Good," he said after a long pause. "They deserved it." The matter-of-fact response caught Caleb by surprise. "Why do you say that?" Brady shrugged his good shoulder. "They came into our house. They hurt me. They were trying to take our land." He looked directly at his father. In nature documentaries, when something threatens the young, the parent eliminates the threat. It's just natural. Caleb recognized the echoes of his own thinking in his son's words. Most people would say humans should operate by different rules. Maybe, Brady conceded, but those men didn't follow the rules either. They chose to be predators. They just picked the wrong target. The conversation shifted to other topics, but Caleb found himself reflecting on Brady's perspective. The boy had processed what had happened through the lens of natural law rather than human legal constructs. There was both wisdom and danger in that viewpoint. Weeks passed. Summer transitioned into early fall. Brady's cast was removed, replaced by a brace he would wear for another month. Tanya completed her move to the city, establishing separate households with a minimum of conflict. The divorce proceedings advanced steadily, the distribution of assets simplified by Caleb's willingness to be generous in financial terms while maintaining sole ownership of their property. Life developed a new rhythm, one that might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of Detective Laura Keegan. She appeared at Caleb's office on a Tuesday morning, presenting her credentials and requesting a few minutes of his time. In her early 40s, with intelligent eyes and the composed demeanor of a seasoned investigator, she represented a more sophisticated threat than the local authorities Caleb had anticipated dealing with eventually. State Police, Caleb noted, examining her ID. Special Investigations Unit. What brings you to River Point, Detective Keegan? The unusual circumstances surrounding Russell Mercer's disappearance, she replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. And his associates, and Charles Beaumont's abrupt departure from the region. It's quite the cluster of coincidences. Caleb maintained a neutral expression. I wasn't aware the state had taken an interest in local business matters. We haven't, Until recently, Keegan explained. But when four men with criminal histories vanish simultaneously and a prominent businessman abandons millions in investments to relocate across the country, it raises questions, especially when those events seem connected to allegations of corruption and coercion. I've heard rumors about Mercer's business practices, Caleb acknowledged, but I'm not sure how I can help your investigation. Keegan smiled slightly. I think you're being modest, Mr. Wolf. Your property was central to Mercer's development plans. Your wife was involved with Mercer personally, and your son was injured in what some might see as a rather convenient accident. The implicit accusation hung in the air between them. Caleb neither confirmed nor denied it, instead asking, "Have you spoken with my wife?" "I have," Keegan confirmed. She provided an interesting perspective. According to Mrs. Wolf, she last saw Russell Mercer and his associates at your home, where they were discussing a potential property sale. She left to take your son to the school nurse after his fall, and when she returned hours later, the men were gone and you were alone. That's accurate, Caleb stated. She also mentioned that your son told her he was pushed down the stairs by one of Mercer's associates. Keegan continued. A man named Travis Holt, according to our records. A man with a history of violence who is now missing. Caleb met her gaze steadily. If you're suggesting I had something to do with these disappearances, Detective, I'd point out that speculation isn't evidence. No, it isn't, Keegan agreed. But coincidences can be compelling, especially when they accumulate. Your military background is particularly interesting in this context. I've been a civilian for 15 years, Caleb reminded her. Yes, running a security consulting business. Keegan nodded. A business that keeps your tactical skills quite sharp, I imagine. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, a careful dance of implication and deflection. Keegan was skilled, Caleb noted, intelligent, observant, and persistent without being aggressive. She was building a circumstantial case based on motive, opportunity, and capability, lacking only direct evidence to connect him to the missing men. When she finally rose to leave, she offered a parting observation. You know what fascinates me about this case, Mr. Wolf? The precision of it. 4 men threaten your family, and within hours they vanish without a trace. A powerful businessman pressures you, and suddenly he abandons everything to move across the country. It's almost military in its execution. An interesting theory, Caleb replied, walking her to the door. But as you said, without evidence, theories remain just that. For now, Keegan agreed. I expect we'll be speaking again soon. After she left, Caleb sat at his desk, reassessing the situation with cold logic. Detective Keegan represented a new variable in his calculations, one with the resources, intelligence, and persistence to potentially uncover what he had done. The question was whether to take preemptive action or allow events to unfold naturally. In his former military role, the decision would have been straightforward. Neutralize the threat before it could develop further. But civilian life operated by different rules, and eliminating a state police detective would create more problems than it solved. Instead, Caleb decided on a strategic repositioning. He would accelerate certain plans that had been developing gradually, establishing additional layers of insulation between his actions and any potential investigation. That evening, he discussed the situation with Brady, maintaining transparency about the potential challenges ahead without burdening his son with unnecessary details. A detective came to see me today, he explained as they prepared dinner together. State police asking questions about Russell Mercer and his associates. Brady's hands stilled momentarily before continuing to chop vegetables. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest she suspects I might be responsible for their disappearance. Brady considered this. Does she have evidence? No, Caleb assured him, and she won't find any. But she's intelligent and determined, which means we need to be prepared for increased scrutiny. What should I do if she wants to talk to me? Brady asked practically. Tell the truth about what happened that day, Caleb advised. About coming home, finding those men there, being pushed down the stairs. About your mother taking you to school instead of the hospital. The detective already knows those details. And if she asks about after, tell her you don't know anything about where those men went, Caleb said. That would be the truth. Brady nodded, accepting this direction. After a moment, he asked, "Are we in danger?" The question cut to the heart of Caleb's concerns, not for himself, but for his son. "Not physical danger," he answered honestly, "but there may be legal complications. I've made arrangements to protect you regardless of what happens." These arrangements were already in motion. Earlier that day, Caleb had contacted his lawyer to establish a trust for Brady that would be secure even if Caleb faced legal challenges. He had also reached out to former military colleagues, men who understood the code of protecting family at all costs and who would ensure Brady was supported if necessary. The detective's appearance accelerated Caleb's timeline for another matter as well. The following morning, he visited Sophia Green at her new workplace, a real estate agency in a neighboring town where she had found employment after Beaumont's departure. "Mr. Wolf," she greeted him nervously when he appeared at her desk. "I didn't expect to see you again." "We need to talk," Caleb said quietly. "Not here." They met during her lunch break at a small park nearby. Caleb came directly to the point. "State police are investigating Mercer's disappearance and Beaumont's departure. A detective named Keegan. She's good at her job." Sophia paled slightly. "What does that have to do with me?" "You provided information about Beaumont's security," Caleb reminded her. "Information that could connect you to subsequent events." "I never asked what you planned to do with that information," Sophia protested. "I just wanted to help after what happened to your son." "I understand," Caleb assured her. "And I have no intention of mentioning your involvement. But if Keegan is thorough, and I believe she is, she may eventually identify our connection." Sophia wrapped her arms around herself despite the warm day. "What should I do?" "Nothing drastic," Caleb advised. "Continue your life as normal. If questioned, acknowledge that you work for Beaumont, but insist your role was strictly professional. The meeting at the pool house never happened. And if they don't believe me?" Caleb studied her, assessing her resilience. "They have no evidence of that meeting. No electronic trail, no witnesses. It would be your word against a theory, and you have no apparent motive to help me." This was true, but incomplete. Caleb had ensured there was no direct evidence linking Sophia to his actions, but determined investigators sometimes found connections through indirect means. It was a calculated risk, one he had accepted when involving her. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," Sophia said quietly. "But after seeing how Beaumont and Russell operated, how they treated people who got in their way." She shook her head. "Sometimes I think they got exactly what they deserved." Caleb neither confirmed nor denied this assessment, instead offering practical advice about maintaining normal routines and avoiding suspicious behavior. As they parted ways, he provided a final instruction. "If you ever feel unsafe or pressured by the investigation, call this number, day or night." The number belonged to one of his former teammates, a man now working in private security who understood the importance of protecting those who had aided a brother in arms. With these precautions in place, Caleb returned his focus to the detective and her investigation. Rather than avoiding Keegan, he adopted a strategy of limited engagement, answering her questions directly when required, providing information that appeared cooperative without revealing anything substantive. When she returned 3 days later with additional questions, he invited her into his home, offered coffee, and responded to her inquiries with calm precision. Yes, he had been aware of his wife's relationship with Russell Mercer. No, he had not confronted Mercer directly about the affair. Yes, he had been angry about his son's injury, but had focused on Brady's medical care rather than seeking confrontation. Throughout their conversation, Caleb maintained the demeanor of a man with nothing to hide, while revealing nothing of significance. It was a technique he had employed during military debriefings. Acknowledge known facts, provide context without additional detail, and project confident openness that discouraged deeper probing. Keegan, for her part, remained professional but persistent. "Your military record is impressive," she noted at one point. "Special operations, multiple combat deployments. The skills you developed would be quite useful in certain situations. They translate well to civilian security work," Caleb agreed neutrally. "And to other applications, I imagine," Keegan suggested. "Tracking individuals. Covert entry." neutralizing threats. Caleb met her gaze steadily. My military service ended 15 years ago, detective. I'm a business owner and a father now. People don't change their fundamental nature, Keegan observed. They adapt it to new circumstances. An interesting philosophical perspective, Caleb replied, but I'm not sure how it relates to your investigation. The detective smiled slightly. It relates to my understanding of motivation and capability. When a trained operator believes his family is threatened, his response would likely be decisive. The implication was clear, but without evidence, it remained merely supposition. Caleb neither confirmed nor denied her assessment, instead steering the conversation back to factual matters she could verify independently. As weeks passed, the investigation continued but gained little traction. The missing men remained missing, their digital and financial footprints ending abruptly on the day of Brady's injury. Beaumont, contacted by state authorities in Arizona, maintained that his relocation had been purely a business decision, citing market conditions and personal preferences for the sudden move. Without bodies, without witnesses, without physical evidence linking Caleb to the disappearances, Keegan's investigation gradually lost momentum. Her visits became less frequent, her questions more perfunctory, though the sharpness of her gaze never diminished when she studied Caleb. For his part, Caleb continued his measured response to her inquiries while proceeding with his plans. The divorce from Tanya was finalized, with terms favorable enough to ensure her continued silence about what she knew or suspected. Brady's recovery progressed well, both physically and emotionally, his resilience evident in his academic performance and social relationships. Life established a new equilibrium, different from before, but stable in its way. Caleb found unexpected satisfaction in this simplified existence, focused on his son and his business without the complications of a failing marriage or external threats. The only shadow remained Detective Keegan, who continued to orbit their lives like a patient satellite, watching and waiting for some mistake or revelation that might never come. Chapter 8. Reckoning. 6 months after Russell Mercer's disappearance, Detective Laura Keegan arrived at Caleb's door without prior notice. Her expression was grimmer than usual, her manner more formal when he invited her inside. "We found something," she stated without preamble once they were seated in his living room. At the old iron mine outside of town, Caleb maintained a neutral expression despite the sudden acceleration of his pulse. The mine had been thoroughly secured, the access points disguised and reinforced to prevent accidental discovery. For Keegan to have found evidence there suggested either extraordinary investigative work or a significant oversight on his part. "The mine has been abandoned for decades," he noted calmly. "What were you looking for there?" "We weren't looking specifically," Keegan explained. "A group of college students exploring the area noticed recent activity around one of the sealed shafts. They reported it to local police, who called us given the ongoing investigation." She studied his reaction carefully as she continued. "The shaft had been professionally secured, not the kind of work teenage thrill-seekers would do. When we investigated, we found traces of blood on rocks near the entrance. Preliminary DNA testing matches Perry Dowd, one of Mercer's missing associates. The information was concerning, but not catastrophic. Traces of blood, rather than bodies, suggested the mine itself remained secure. Still, it provided Keegan with the first physical evidence, potentially connecting the missing men to foul play rather than voluntary disappearance. "That seems significant," Caleb acknowledged. "But I'm not sure why you're telling me." "Because we also found boot prints," Keegan replied. "High-end tactical boots, size 11. The same type and size you're wearing right now." Caleb glanced down at his footwear, quality boots he had worn during his security work for years. "These are common boots, detective, available in any outdoor store." "True," she conceded, "but interesting in context. We also analyzed soil particulates embedded in the tread pattern at the mine. They matched soil samples from your property." This was more problematic. Caleb had been careful to change footwear after the disposal operation, but microscopic evidence was difficult to eliminate completely. "I work and live on my property," he pointed out reasonably. "Any boots I would likely pick up soil from here." and I hike throughout this region regularly. Without establishing when those prints were made, the connection seems tenuous. Keegan nodded, acknowledging the point. Circumstantial, certainly, but it adds to an accumulating pattern. She leaned forward slightly. Mr. Wolf, I've been investigating homicides for 17 years. I've learned to recognize when seemingly separate pieces form a larger picture. The picture here suggests that Russell Mercer and his associates threatened your family, hurt your son, and subsequently encountered someone with the skills and determination to ensure they never threatened anyone again. The assessment was accurate, but still lacked definitive proof. Caleb maintained his composed demeanor. That's an interesting theory, Detective. But theories aren't evidence. No, Keegan agreed. But they guide where we look for evidence. And we're looking very carefully now. After she left, Caleb conducted a thorough assessment of his position. The blood evidence and boot prints were concerning developments, but far from conclusive. More troubling was Keegan's persistence and methodical approach. She was gradually assembling the components of a case that, while circumstantial, might eventually become compelling enough for prosecution. The rational response would be to eliminate the investigation's momentum, either by discrediting the evidence or by removing Keegan herself from the equation. The former was challenging but potentially achievable. The latter, while technically feasible, would violate Caleb's personal code. Keegan was not a threat to his family, but simply an officer performing her duty. Eliminating her would cross a line he was unwilling to traverse. Instead, Caleb developed a contingency strategy. If the investigation reached a critical threshold where arrest became likely, he would implement an exit plan developed during his initial actions against Russell and his associates. This plan included resources, identities, and secure locations established as insurance against exactly this scenario. But before such measures became necessary, he would attempt a different approach, one that acknowledged Keegan's intelligence while offering a perspective she might not have fully considered. 2 days later, Caleb requested a meeting with the detective at a neutral location, a small park overlooking the lake. When she arrived, he was already seated on a bench, watching the water reflect the afternoon sunlight. "Thank you for coming," he said as she sat beside him. "I thought we should talk outside of official channels." Keegan raised an eyebrow. "Are you planning to confess, Mr. Wolf?" "I'm planning to have an honest conversation," Caleb replied. "About perspectives." He gestured toward the lake. "When I was in Special Forces, we operated in environments where conventional law enforcement didn't exist or couldn't function effectively. We made decisions based on clear objectives: protect civilians, eliminate threats, ensure mission success. This isn't a war zone," Keegan pointed out. "We have laws, courts, due process." "Yes," Caleb acknowledged. "Systems designed to deliver justice under ideal circumstances. But systems that can be manipulated, corrupted, or simply overwhelmed by those with enough resources and connections." He turned to face her directly. "Hypothetically, if someone threatened your family, not just with words, but with actions that caused actual harm, what would you do?" "I'd use the legal system," Keegan answered. "File charges, obtain restraining orders, follow procedure. And if that someone had the influence to avoid consequences, if they had demonstrated both the willingness and ability to cause harm despite legal constraints." Keegan didn't answer immediately, her expression thoughtful. "The law doesn't recognize preemptive self-defense, Mr. Wolf. We can't legally act against potential future harm, only respond to immediate threats. That's the limitation of the system," Caleb noted. "It often requires victims before it acknowledges predators. For someone trained to identify and neutralize threats before casualties occur, that limitation can seem unacceptable." They sat in silence for a moment, the implication of his words hanging between them. "Are you suggesting that Russell Mercer and his associates represented an ongoing threat that couldn't be addressed through legal channels?" Keegan finally asked. "I'm suggesting that different perspectives lead to different conclusions about appropriate responses," Caleb replied carefully. "In some cultures and contexts, a direct response to those who harm family members isn't viewed as criminal, but as necessary and just." Keegan studied him. "Justice and vengeance aren't the same thing." "Perhaps," Caleb conceded. But they intersect when systems designed for the former fail to protect people from predators. Their conversation continued for another 30 minutes, neither directly addressing the investigation, but instead exploring the philosophical boundaries between legal justice and moral imperatives. Throughout, Caleb maintained the hypothetical nature of their discussion, while Keegan demonstrated a surprisingly nuanced understanding of the ethical complexities involved. As they prepared to part ways, Keegan offered an observation. "You know what's interesting about this case, Mr. Wolf? The precision of it. If Russell Mercer and his associates were eliminated, it was done without collateral damage, without public risk, without creating panic. The only people affected were those who had caused harm." Caleb met her gaze. "An interesting observation. It suggests someone operating by a code," she continued. "Not indiscriminate violence, but targeted action against specific threats. It doesn't make it legal, but it does reflect a certain discipline." She stood to leave. "I'm still investigating, Mr. Wolf. That's my job, and I take it seriously. But I understand perspectives better than you might think." The meeting left Caleb with a revised assessment of Detective Keegan. She remained a potential threat to his freedom, but her understanding of his motivations, even if never explicitly acknowledged, suggested she viewed the case with more complexity than simply pursuing a criminal. This impression was reinforced 2 weeks later when Keegan contacted him with an update. The investigation into the mine evidence was being scaled back due to contamination issues that made forensic conclusions unreliable. The boot print evidence, upon further analysis, had proven inconclusive for establishing a definitive timeline or unique identification. While the investigation officially remained open, its momentum had effectively stalled. Whether this resulted from legitimate evidentiary challenges or from Keegan's personal decision to allocate resources elsewhere remained unclear. What was clear was that the immediate threat of arrest had diminished significantly. This development allowed Caleb to focus on rebuilding life with Brady, who had fully recovered physically and was thriving academically. The boy had been accepted into a prestigious marine biology program for the following summer, his passion for ocean ecosystems undiminished by the turmoil of the past year. Tanya had settled into her new life in the city, maintaining regular contact with Brady while keeping a respectful distance from Caleb. Their interactions, when necessary for co-parenting, remained civil but distant. Two people who had once shared everything now connected only by their son. As for Charles Beaumont, he had indeed established himself in Arizona, his business activities there notably more legitimate than his previous ventures. Occasional monitoring suggested he had taken the lessons of his abduction seriously, avoiding any connections to his former associates or business practices in River Point. Life had reached a new equilibrium, one that Caleb found surprisingly satisfying. The property that had been the focus of so much conflict remained in his possession, its value now enhanced by the collapse of the development project that would have transformed the lakefront into a commercial zone. More importantly, Brady was safe and thriving. The threat to his well-being had been eliminated. The consequences for those responsible delivered with the precision and finality that had characterized Caleb's military operations. If there was a price for these actions, in moral terms, in the constant vigilance required to maintain operational security, in a lingering presence of Detective Keegan at the periphery of their lives, it was one Caleb paid willingly. Some debts, after all, could only be settled in blood. Chapter 9. Blood Ties. 1 year to the day after Russell Mercer's disappearance, Caleb received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing a time, date, and the name of a restaurant in the city where Tanya now lived. No signature, no explanation, just those simple details. Caleb considered the possibilities. It could be from Tanya, though the lack of identification seemed unnecessary. It might be from Detective Keegan, whose investigation had gone dormant but never officially closed. Or it could represent a new threat, perhaps connected to Russell's former associates or Beaumont's investors. After careful consideration, Caleb decided to attend the meeting. If it was a trap, he was confident in his ability to identify and avoid it. If it was a legitimate contact, ignoring it might represent a missed opportunity for valuable intelligence. The restaurant was upscale, but not ostentatious, located in a renovated warehouse district that had become fashionable in recent years. Caleb arrived 30 minutes early, conducting a thorough assessment of the location, identifying exits, and establishing situational awareness before entering. Inside, he selected a table with clear sight lines to both the entrance and the kitchen, positioning himself with his back to a wall, habits that had become second nature during his military service and remained useful in civilian life. At precisely the appointed time, a woman entered the restaurant. In her early 20s, with dark hair and familiar features, she scanned the room with purpose before her gaze settled on Caleb. Without hesitation, she approached his table. "Mr. Wolf," she greeted him, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming. I'm Elise Mercer." The surname immediately triggered Caleb's heightened awareness, though he maintained an outwardly calm demeanor as he gestured for her to be seated. "Russell Mercer's daughter," she explained, confirming his assumption. "I believe you and my father had some unfinished business." Caleb studied her carefully. The physical resemblance to Russell was subtle but present, something in the set of her eyes and the line of her jaw. Her manner was composed, her gaze direct and evaluative. "I knew your father," Caleb acknowledged neutrally. "Though not well. Better than most, I think," Elise replied with a slight smile that held no warmth. "Considering you're the last person to see him alive." The blunt statement hung between them, neither accusation nor question, but simple declaration. Caleb didn't respond immediately, assessing her purpose and potential threat level. "That's an interesting assumption," he finally said. "Your father disappeared a year ago. Many people might have seen him since then." Elise shook her head slightly. "Let's not play games, Mr. Wolf. I've spent the past year investigating my father's disappearance. More thoroughly than the police, I might add. I know about his affair with your wife. I know about his business dealings with Charles Beaumont. I know about what happened to your son." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "And I know my father and his associates visited your home the day they vanished." Caleb maintained his composed expression while recalculating risk assessments. Elise Mercer represented a potential threat, but her approach, direct confrontation in a public setting, suggested her intentions might not be hostile. "Why are we having this conversation?" he asked directly. "Closure," Elise replied. "And information." She leaned forward slightly. "My father wasn't a good man, Mr. Wolf. I've known that since I was 12 years old, and found financial records that showed how he drove my mother's family business into bankruptcy while diverting assets to his own accounts. I've spent most of my life watching him manipulate, threaten, and destroy people who got in his way." This was unexpected. Caleb had anticipated resentment or accusations, not this cold assessment of Russell's character from his own daughter. "If you're aware of his nature, what information are you seeking?" Caleb asked. "Confirmation," Elise said simply. "I need to know for certain that he's gone, not somewhere planning his return or rebuilding his operations, but genuinely gone." The request was reasonable but potentially incriminating. Caleb chose his words with precision. "What makes you think I could provide that confirmation?" "Because you're the only person who had both the motive and the capability to ensure Russell Mercer never threatened anyone again," Elise stated matter-of-factly. "I've researched your background, Mr. Wolf, your military service, your specialized training, your record in combat operations." She held his gaze steadily. "My father hurt your son. In my experience, that would be unforgivable to someone with your background." The assessment was accurate enough to warrant careful response. "If your father is indeed gone, as you suspect, what would you do with that confirmation?" "Nothing," Elise answered. "I have no interest in justice for Russell Mercer. He forfeited any claim to that when he chose to live as he did." She paused, then added, "I simply need to know whether I should continue looking over my shoulder for his return, or if I can finally close that chapter of my life and move forward." Caleb considered her request and the risk it represented. Providing explicit confirmation would be an admission of guilt to a murder, unwise even if Elise had no intention of taking the information to authorities. However, her need for certainty was understandable and, in its way, deserved resolution. "Your father made choices Caleb said carefully. Choices that put him in conflict with people who had different priorities than his business interests. People who valued family above property or profit. He held her gaze directly. If I were you, I wouldn't waste any more time looking over my shoulder. The chapter you mentioned is closed. Permanently. Elise studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly, seeming to find the confirmation she sought in his careful phrasing. Thank you for your honesty. Why did you wait a year to have this conversation? Caleb asked, curious about her timing. I needed to be certain about your character before approaching you, she explained. To understand whether you were someone who eliminated my father out of vengeance or protection. The distinction matters to me. And your conclusion? That you're a protector by nature, Elise replied. That what happened to my father and his associates wasn't random violence or excessive retaliation, but the necessary removal of a threat to your family. I can respect that, even if others might view it differently. The assessment was perceptive and largely accurate. Caleb had indeed acted primarily to eliminate a threat rather than to punish its source, though the distinction was perhaps finer than Elise recognized. There's something else you should know, she continued after a moment. My father had other associates, business partners who weren't involved in his day-to-day operations, but who provided financial backing and political connections. People who lost significant investments when his development projects collapsed. This was valuable intelligence that aligned with Caleb's own information. Have these partners shown interest in reviving those projects? Not directly, Elise replied, but they've been making inquiries about property in the region, particularly lakefront parcels, using different proxies this time, more carefully distanced from their actual interests. She reached in her bag and removed a flash drive, placing it on the table between them. This contains everything I've gathered about these individuals, names, corporate entities, financial structures. I thought you might find it useful. Caleb regarded the drive with measured interest. Why provide this to me? Because I've spent my life watching my father destroy people and communities for profit. Elise answered, a hint of intensity breaking through her composed demeanor. I have no intention of allowing his associates to continue that legacy. You've demonstrated both the capability and willingness to stop such operations definitively. The implication was clear. She was providing intelligence not just for Caleb's protection, but with the expectation that he might act against these individuals if they posed a renewed threat. That's a significant assumption about my intentions, Caleb observed. Elise smiled slightly. Is it incorrect? Rather than answering directly, Caleb asked a question of his own. What are your plans now? You mentioned moving forward. I've established a legal consulting practice specializing in identifying and challenging predatory development projects, she explained, using my knowledge of how my father operated to help communities protect themselves through legal channels. It was an interesting symmetry, the daughter using her understanding of the father's methods to oppose rather than advance his type of operations. Caleb found himself respecting her choice. A worthwhile endeavor, he acknowledged, though potentially dangerous if the individuals on this drive discover your activities. I'm aware of the risks, Elise assured him, which is another reason for this meeting. I thought we might establish a mutual understanding, a channel of communication that could be valuable to both of us in the future. The proposal was unexpected but logical. Elise had information networks and legal expertise that complemented Caleb's more direct capabilities. An alliance, however informal, could provide additional security for both parties. A reasonable suggestion, Caleb agreed, pocketing the flash drive. Though any communication would need to be appropriately secure. They spent the next 30 minutes establishing protocols for potential future contact, methods that would be encrypted, deniable, and irregular enough to avoid establishing detectable patterns. Throughout the discussion, Caleb continued to evaluate Elise's reliability and motivations, finding no obvious contradictions or warning signs. As their meeting concluded, Elise offered a final observation. You know, Mr. Wolf, my father never understood the concept of consequences. He believed his money and connections would always protect him from the natural results of his actions. A common misconception, Caleb noted. Yes, Elise agreed, and a fatal one in his case. I hope his associates prove more perceptive, but if not, she let the implication hang unfinished between them. They parted ways with a handshake and the unspoken understanding that their connection, while unlikely, served mutual interests. Caleb watched her leave, reflecting on the unexpected development. Russell Mercer's daughter had become, in effect, an ally rather than an adversary, another layer of security for the life he had rebuilt with Brady. On the drive home, Caleb considered the information Elise had provided. If verified, it suggested the need for ongoing vigilance rather than immediate action. The potential threats were still at a distance, evaluating rather than engaging, which provided time for proper assessment and, if necessary, preparation. Brady was waiting when he arrived home, excited about a new development in his college applications. As Caleb listened to his son's enthusiastic explanation of marine research opportunities, he felt the familiar certainty that had guided his actions from the beginning. Protecting this young man was worth any cost, any risk, any moral compromise others might perceive. Some would call it vigilante justice. Others might see it as a father's natural response to threats against his child. The distinction mattered little to Caleb. What mattered was that Brady was safe, thriving, and looking toward a future unburdened by the shadows that had briefly threatened to engulf him. If maintaining that safety required Caleb to continue serving as the unseen guardian against those who would threaten his family, whether Russell Mercer's former associates or others who might emerge in the future, so be it. He had made his choice the moment he'd seen his son lying in that hospital bed, and it was a choice he would never regret. 2 weeks after his meeting with Elise Mercer, Detective Keegan made what would be her final official visit. She arrived unannounced one evening as Caleb was grilling steaks on the deck overlooking the lake. "This is becoming a habit, Detective," he observed, turning a ribeye with practiced precision. "Though usually you call first." "This isn't an official visit," Keegan replied, accepting the beer he offered. "I've been reassigned. State-level task force focusing on political corruption." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Sounds interesting." "It is," she confirmed, "particularly since some of the targets have connections to Charles Beaumont and his former investment partners." The implication wasn't subtle. Keegan was informing him that her new role would focus on the same power structures that had enabled Russell Mercer's operations. "Before I transfer," she continued, "I wanted to inform you personally that the investigation into Russell Mercer's disappearance has been officially classified as inactive due to lack of actionable evidence." Caleb maintained his neutral expression. "I appreciate the courtesy." Keegan studied him for a long moment. "You know what's remarkable about this case, Mr. Wolf? How cleanly it resolved itself. The men who threatened your family disappeared. The corruption they represented was exposed. Your son recovered fully, and not a single innocent person was harmed in the process. A fortunate outcome," Caleb acknowledged carefully. "Fortune seldom works with such precision," Keegan observed. "In my experience, when something appears this clean, it suggests exceptional planning and execution." She finished her beer and set the bottle down. "I never found enough evidence to build a case against you, Mr. Wolf. And to be entirely honest, I'm not entirely sure I wanted to." The admission was unexpected. Caleb regarded her with new interest. "That's an unusual perspective for a detective." "Sometimes the system works," Keegan said, "and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes justice requires alternative approaches." She straightened, her professional demeanor returning. "I hope we don't meet again professionally, Mr. Wolf. Take care of your son." As she turned to leave, Caleb asked, "Would you have made the arrest if you'd found the evidence?" Keegan paused, considering the question seriously. "I would have done my duty," she finally answered, "but I wouldn't have been happy about it." After she departed, Caleb reflected on their exchange while finishing the steaks. Detective Keegan had essentially acknowledged what she believed he had done while simultaneously closing the door on any further investigation. It was, in its way, her own form of justice, recognizing that some predators existed beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement and required different methods of neutralization. Brady joined him on the deck, setting plates and utensils on the outdoor table. At 17, he had grown another 2 inches, his frame filling out with the lean muscle of adolescence. More striking was the confidence in his bearing, the absence of the shadows that had briefly clouded his eyes after the incident with Travis. "Who was that?" he asked, having glimpsed Keegan's departure from his bedroom window. "Detective Keegan," Caleb replied, saying goodbye. "She's been reassigned." Brady nodded, absorbing this information. "So the case is closed?" "Inactive," Caleb corrected, "but effectively yes." A small smile touched Brady's lips. "Good. That means we can finally move forward without looking back." They ate dinner as the sun set over the lake, discussing Brady's upcoming college visits and his summer research program. Ordinary conversation between father and son, unmarked by the extraordinary events that had nearly derailed their lives a year earlier. Later that evening, as Brady worked on homework, Caleb retreated to his office to review the information Elise Mercer had provided. The flash drive contained meticulously organized data on the financial backers behind Russell's operations: names, corporate structures, investment patterns, and personal vulnerabilities. It was professional quality intelligence, suggesting Elise had inherited her father's attention to detail, if not his moral bankruptcy. Of particular interest were documents linking several of these individuals to new property acquisitions in the region through elaborate shell companies. These purchases formed a pattern similar to Russell's earlier activities, strategic properties that, collectively, could support another development project once certain regulatory hurdles were cleared. Caleb studied these materials with clinical detachment, assessing potential threats rather than immediate actions. The investors were being cautious, maintaining multiple layers of separation between themselves and their activities. They had learned from Russell's mistakes, or at least believed they had. For now, they represented a situation to monitor rather than a direct threat requiring elimination. Caleb established a surveillance protocol, utilizing both digital tools and human intelligence from contacts in local government and business. If these individuals crossed the threshold from business operations to personal threats, he would be prepared to respond accordingly. 3 weeks later, Caleb received an unexpected visitor. Tanya arrived on a Sunday afternoon, looking uncomfortable but determined as she stood on the porch of the home they had once shared. "I need to talk to you," she said when he opened the door. "About Brady's graduation." Caleb stepped aside to let her enter, noting that she hesitated before crossing the threshold. The house had become foreign territory to her, a place where she was now an outsider despite having lived there for nearly 2 decades. "Brady's at the library," he informed her, leading the way to the kitchen. "He won't be back for a few hours." "That's probably better," Tanya acknowledged, declining his offer of coffee. "What I have to say is for you anyway." She sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped tightly together. "I've met someone," she announced without preamble. "His name is Dennis. He's an architect I met through work. We're getting married next month." Caleb absorbed this information without visible reaction. "Congratulations." "Thank you," Tanya replied, seeming surprised by his neutral response. "He's a good man. Nothing like." She trailed off, unwilling to speak Russell's name in this house. "Why are you telling me this?" Caleb asked directly. "Our divorce is final. Your personal life is your business." Tanya met his gaze for the first time since entering. "Because Dennis has accepted a position with a firm in Seattle. We'll be moving after the wedding, and I wanted to discuss how that affects my relationship with Brady. The distance would certainly complicate the co-parenting arrangements they had established, though Brady would be leaving for college soon regardless. Still, this represented a significant change in Tanya's involvement in their son's life. "Brady will be disappointed," Caleb observed. "I know," Tanya acknowledged, regret visible in her expression. "But I need a fresh start, Caleb. Somewhere without all these memories, without the constant reminders." The unspoken truth hung between them. Reminders not just of their failed marriage, but of what had happened afterward. The men who had disappeared. The questions that remained officially unanswered, but that Tanya, better than most, could guess at. "Brady will understand," Caleb finally said. "He's more perceptive than either of us sometimes realize." Tanya nodded, relief evident in the slight relaxation of her shoulders. "There's one more thing," she added after a moment. "I wanted to apologize. Not just for the affair, but for not protecting Brady that day, for not taking him directly to the hospital, for prioritizing Russell over our son. It was the first time she had acknowledged this failure so directly. Caleb studied her, seeing genuine remorse, but also the self-interest that had always been a fundamental part of her character. Some mistakes can't be undone, he replied evenly. Some betrayals can't be forgiven. Tanya flinched slightly at his bluntness. I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say it before I leave. She stood to depart, hesitating at the door. What you did after, for Brady. I want you to know I understand why. Caleb neither confirmed nor denied her implicit reference to his actions against Russell and his associates. Everything I do is for Brady. I know, Tanya said softly. That's always been the difference between us. After she left, Caleb reflected on her visit and what it represented. Tanya's departure to Seattle with her new husband would create additional distance between her and the events in River Point. Her silence about what she knew or suspected would be further secured by her new life and relationship. It was, from a tactical perspective, an advantageous development. On a personal level, Caleb felt nothing beyond mild satisfaction that this chapter was closing completely. Whatever love he had once felt for Tanya had died long before he had taken action against Russell Mercer. Her betrayal, not just the affair, but the willingness to endanger their son for her own interests, had severed any emotional connection that might have warranted forgiveness. Some acts, once committed, changed the fundamental nature of relationships. Some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. Caleb's capacity for forgiveness, never his most prominent quality, had distinct boundaries. Family safety was the most inviolable of those boundaries. Brady's graduation came in early June, a perfect late spring day with clear skies and mild temperatures. Caleb watched with quiet pride as his son accepted his diploma, graduating with honors and a full scholarship to the marine biology program of his choice. Tanya attended with her fiancé, maintaining appropriate distance from Caleb while focusing her attention on Brady. Afterward, as family and friends gathered at the Wolf home for a celebration, Caleb observed his son moving confidently among his peers, his arm fully healed, his future bright with possibilities that had nearly been derailed a year earlier. Detective Keegan made a brief appearance, offering congratulations to Brady before exchanging a meaningful glance with Caleb, acknowledgement between two people who understood each other's code despite their different perspectives on its application. As the party wound down, Brady found Caleb standing alone on the deck, watching the sunset reflect across the lake. Thanks, Dad, he said simply, joining him at the railing. For everything. The words carried weight beyond the typical graduation gratitude. Both knew what everything encompassed, not just the conventional support of father for his son, but the extraordinary measures Caleb had taken to ensure Brady's safety and future. You never have to thank me for that, Caleb replied, resting a hand briefly on his son's shoulder. It's what fathers do. Brady smiled slightly. Not all fathers. No, Caleb acknowledged. Not all. They stood in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, the first stars appearing over the water. The home that Russell Mercer and Charles Beaumont had coveted for their development project remained a sanctuary, the land uncompromised by their ambitions. In the months and years that followed, Caleb maintained his security consulting business while keeping a watchful eye on the activities Elise Mercer had identified. The investors behind Russell occasionally tested the waters with property acquisitions or political contributions, but their operations remained distant and cautious, aware, perhaps, that aggressive moves might trigger responses they weren't prepared to face. Brady thrived in college, his occasional visits home bringing life and energy to the house that Caleb otherwise inhabited alone. During one such visit, 3 years after graduation, Brady broached a subject they had tacitly avoided in direct conversation. I met Russell Mercer's daughter, he said as they worked on Caleb's boat, preparing it for the summer season. Elise. She gave a lecture on predatory development practices at our environmental law symposium. Caleb continued sanding a rail, his expression neutral. Interesting. What did you think of her? She's smart. Intense, Brady replied, watching his father carefully. She mentioned meeting you once. We had a conversation, Caleb confirmed. Brady nodded, processing this information. After a moment, he asked, the men who hurt me, Russell, Travis, the others, they're never coming back, are they? It was the most direct question his son had ever asked about the events of that day and their aftermath. Caleb set down his sandpaper and met Brady's gaze directly. No, he said simply. They're never coming back. Brady held his father's gaze, understanding the confirmation contained in those few words. Good, he said quietly. They made their choice. Yes, Caleb agreed. They did. No further discussion was necessary. The bond between father and son included an understanding that some actions, while outside conventional morality, were necessary and justified when family was threatened. Not legal, perhaps, but right in a more fundamental sense that predated legal systems. The primal imperative to protect one's offspring at any cost. Tanya remained in Seattle with her new husband, maintaining occasional contact with Brady, but never returning to River Point. Detective Keegan's corruption task force eventually led to indictments against several of Beaumont's former political allies, though Beaumont himself remained in Arizona, rebuilding his life with a caution born of hard experience. Elise Mercer continued her work opposing predatory development.